Chapter 449. The architectural styles of the cities in the other world were very different, but there was still a general pattern to follow. Other than special topography, such as being near mountains and rivers, most of the other cities had 4 gates. Therefore, Tang En and the others who set off from the West Gate naturally did not know what was happening dozens of kilometers away from the North Gate. However, this was not a small matter, and naturally, it would not remain silent. In fact, after Bose and the others returned to Mountain Stream City, they immediately reported Yema's existence to the church in the city. Needless to say, it was naturally a huge shock. On the surface, in the article that Tang En had written, it was Eunice, Sang Pu, Oliver, and the others who had cooperated to destroy the Saintess statue, and it was now confirmed that they had been killed one by one. However, how could the authority of the Temple of Light be blasphemed? The only remaining leader of the Dusk Hunter group, Yema, was still wanted in the open and in the dark. Bose did not hide anything. First, he sent Yema's portrait, and then he explained the situation one by one. The bishop in the city was naturally shocked that Yema had touched the threshold of void rank. Fortunately, the second batch of the Temple of Light team that wanted to kill Sang Pu and Oliver had not yet left the north, so the order to pursue and kill was quickly issued. It was already 3 days later when Josiah and the others received the information from the secret organization. In the carriage that was moving at a constant speed, Tang En's breathing stagnated when he first saw the information. A chill ran up his spine and he almost jumped up, but then he felt a lingering fear. Damn, luckily I ran fast enough. After the fierce battle with Sang Pu and the others, Tang En's strength had increased a lot, but he did not have the confidence to fight a battle with Yema. Touching the threshold of void rank and earth rank were 2 completely different concepts. He could kill Sang Pu by luck, but if he fought Yema alone, he would definitely die. Because of the merger of the teams, Philip now stayed by Tang En's side all day, or more accurately, he wanted to rely on Josiah. At this moment, he happened to be at the side. According to the intelligence report, the golden sword light that appeared out of nowhere and repelled Yema. He opened his mouth but didn't say a word. At this time, Tang En calmed down and found the information suspicious. There was no doubt that Yema had gone to look for Bose, but in the end, he returned without success. This was puzzling. Bose was at most at the peak of the advanced level, and so was the Bugnes. As for the ordinary cavalry, they were even weaker. Where did this terrifying golden sword ray come from? That thief who escaped? That's not right. If that thief really had such strength, how could he have been captured by Bose? Pa! Suddenly, Philip, who was at the side, hit his palm hard. The corner of his mouth twitched, and he had a pained expression. He muttered intermittently, "Dagger, dagger. I actually used it. Damn, I can't even bear it. Ah, my little heart, I can't take it anymore, I can't take it anymore." Looking at Philip's epileptic behavior, Tang En's mind flashed. He was stunned, and then he said hesitantly, "Thief, dagger. You mean that thief is Jack? Dagger, the one you have?" "Of course it is. Damn Jack, damn it, why didn't I think of coming over in the first place, damn it?" Philip kept beating his chest and stamping his feet. He looked like he was in pain, and he regretted it. Is it really Jack? This guy is so unlucky? Tang En was also speechless when he heard this, but he reacted in an instant. He looked at Philip suspiciously. "Wait, you mean the golden sword light was emitted by that dagger? Damn, who the hell are you?" Tang En was really shocked. A single sword strike repelled a void-level warrior, and the initiator of the attack was actually a dagger that had no self-consciousness. What an incredible and unreasonable situation. Don't ask. Philip waved his hand sadly. This dagger was given to me by an elder when I became an adult. He sealed a sword light in a special bead on the hilt for me to protect myself. Oh, in that case. Tang En rubbed his nose awkwardly. No matter what, Jack had taken the dagger away right under his nose, so he suggested, "Well, Why don't I go back with you to find Jack and get the dagger back? Forget it, it's useless. Shaking his head, Philip held his forehead and said weakly, There is only one sword light in the dagger. After it is released, the special bead will automatically shatter, and the dagger will return to its normal appearance. Sigh. Damn, it turns out that this is just a one-time item. Tang En also sighed when he heard this, feeling quite regretful. If the dagger could be used a few more times, Tang En would definitely pull Philip and dig 3 feet into the ground to find Jack. With such a terrifying sword light in hand, Sesman and Sylvia would be easily eliminated. Revenge must be taken. Hey, wait! Tang En's heart suddenly moved, and he glanced at Philip's waist. I remember that when you were at the hotel, in addition to the dagger, you also had an inconspicuous belt. What do you want? Philip didn't have time to lament and held his waist. Nothing. Tang En casually retracted his fiery gaze and picked up the teapot with a smile. Come, have some tea, have some tea. Well, Philip, you and I have known each other for a long time. Stop, stop. Philip quickly interrupted and smiled bitterly. Tang, you can't take advantage of a situation like this. Your strength is already so high, and you still want to take advantage of me? This is called sharing blessings. Sigh, no, my enemy is stronger. Philip shook his head helplessly and continued to smile bitterly. Tang, it's not that I don't want to help you. Well, yes, this belt has some special functions, but it is different from the dagger used to attack. Its main function is to protect my life, and other than me, no one else in this world can use it. Tang En was surprised. What do you mean? My family has a single heir, and this belt needs to be verified by the bloodline. You know that, right? Philip explained, so other than me, even if anyone else gets this belt, they can only tie it around their waist as a decoration. Tang En grimaced as if he had a toothache, and was a little speechless. He knew about the bloodline verification. As the name implied, it could only be produced between direct blood relatives. Without a doubt, this method of verification was undoubtedly safe, even safer than magical means. However, the implementation of this method was too difficult, and now it was almost lost. Tang En only learned about it from the old butler because the system often scanned the books. Shaking his head, Tang En reluctantly gave up on this plan, but he still looked at Philip unwillingly and smacked his lips. I didn't expect you to be a treasure trove. Well, tell me honestly, how many more good things are you hiding? Damn, I really don't have anything this time. Philip took out his jacket pocket and hung it outside to show his innocence, and said helplessly, Do you think this thing is like bread that can be taken out casually? This is all given to me by my elders, and no amount of money can buy it. Sigh, my dagger, my fragile little heart. Well, in any case, you saved Jack's life, didn't you? Well, that guy's life is a little cheap. Cough, cough, but he's also a friend. If I can sacrifice myself for my friend, this little thing is nothing, don't you think? Spreading out his hands, Tang En comforted him. That's true. Well, but what should I do now that I want to stab him twice? The merge team was not affected by Yema's incident, and they were still moving towards the 100,000 mountains at a steady pace. In this way, it was not that Tang En and the others looked down on Yema, but in fact, Yema was a major hidden danger to Tang En and the entire Grey Coat army. However, now that Yema could not possibly know Tang En's whereabouts, he naturally could not be considered a threat. Moreover, although the intelligence did not state whether Yema was alive or dead after being hit by the terrifying sword, according to Philip's confident speculation, even if Yema was not dead, he was at least half dead. Moreover, now that the Temple of Light's team had intervened in the pursuit, Yema was now in a situation where he could not even protect himself, so naturally, it was even more impossible for him to think of them. The truth was more or less the same. As the team continued to approach the 100,000 mountains, the intelligence regarding this news was delivered one after another. In the end, Yema escaped the disaster and did not die under the golden sword light. However, just a few days later, he was successfully caught up by the Temple of Light's team. When Tang En saw this intelligence, other than letting out a long sigh, non-mainstream causes people to die, he was filled with fear. As for the rest, they were filled with fear and apprehension. One could see the whole leopard at a glance. Normally, the Temple of Light's job was to spread faith, and they did not do anything earth-shattering. However, when it was operating at full strength, this huge monster truly showed its horror. It did not take much effort to find a person in a vast area and a vast sea of people. Of course, Yama's own reasons also played a part in this. It was unknown whether it was because he did not expect the Temple of Light to come so quickly, or because he was too confident in his own strength, but he did not disguise himself. In particular, his long non-mainstream silver hair was really eye-catching. The first battle ended with Yama's escape. This did not mean that there was a huge disparity in strength between the two sides, but Yama was seriously injured. Even his left arm was missing, and he became a one-armed hunter. After that, there were very few battles. Yama did not manage to shake off the Temple of Light's team, but the people from the Temple of Light did not have the chance to severely injure Yama either. Both sides ran and chased, crossing thousands of miles in the north. Tang En had found a map and found that except for some special restricted areas, Yama almost never changed his direction and headed straight north. It seemed that he wanted to escape to the northern wilderness. Of course, this was also the best choice. After all, in the Bran Empire, the Temple of Light's strength made people unable to resist. After guessing this, Tang En shook his head and sighed in relief. Although it was a pity that Yama was not killed, as long as the other party escaped to the northern wilderness, the threat to him would undoubtedly be reduced to the minimum. Then, the team entered the 100,000 Mountains. Chapter 450. On the winding mountain path in the 100,000 Mountains. Sir, be careful. Be careful, be careful. Don't you know how to say something else? This damned broken path, damned negotiations, damned grey coat army, damned new nobles, damned. In short, everything is damned. The cavalryman thought for a while and said hesitantly, Sir, be careful. You. Before he could vent his anger, it was suddenly covered by a cry of surprise. Sir. Someone help me, Sir has fallen into a ditch. The 100,000 Mountains could be said to be barren, so the roads naturally couldn't be good. In fact, not long after they entered, this negotiation team could only abandon the carriages and change to horses. But even so, there were still some places that were not easy to travel through. And the nobles were used to living like princes, so they naturally couldn't bear the pain of the bumpy ride and the rough weather. Ronald and the others were fine. After all, they had a mission, so they could still grit their teeth and endure it. But Simpson and the other traditional nobles were in big trouble. They had come here unwillingly, and now they were being tortured. Of course, they couldn't help but curse as if they had eaten exploding crystals. Tang En and Josiah came up from behind and asked Philip, who was walking back, "Why aren't you moving?" Philip spread his hands and said helplessly, "Someone fell into a ditch, and we're trying to get him out." Josiah was slightly stunned. "Are you okay?" "It's okay, that ditch isn't deep and there's water. It's just a little embarrassing at most." Philip waved his hand nonchalantly. Then, he looked at the dispirited nobles and turned to ask, "How far is it?" "Well, I'm afraid these old fellows won't be able to take it." Tang En replied, "If the previous information and map are accurate, well, we'll reach it after crossing this mountain." "We still have to cross the mountain?" An old voice filled with grief and indignation came from the side. Simpson walked over shakily with a wooden stick in his hand. His originally gorgeous robe now looked more like a tramp's outfit that had been pieced together. What kind of joke is this? We've already climbed countless mountains. I swear that I've never walked this far in my entire life, and we still have to climb mountains. No, I strongly request to rest now." "I'm sorry, sir. We rested half an hour ago, so we have to keep going. Josiah's tone was calm, but his attitude was firm. Although I don't know how far you've traveled in your life, we've only crossed 10 mountains including this one. Oh my God, it's already the 10th mountain! Simpson's body was shaking, like a candle in the wind. His voice was even more desolate. No. If we go any further, someone will die. This is murder, plain murder. Josiah frowned and wanted to say something, but at this moment, a burst of chaotic sounds mixed with the clashing of weapons suddenly came from the front. What's going on? Is it bandits, is it? Simpson, who was on the verge of collapsing, suddenly looked like a rabbit that had been shot by an arrow. He took a quick step and nimbly leaped behind Philip as he asked in a trembling voice. There was naturally a reason for such a violent reaction. Other than the mountains, the 100,000 mountains had the most bandits and bandit. Due to the stalemate between the Grey Coat Army and the Brand soldiers, the rear had been cleaned up by Blank's army. However, it was certain that there were still bandits who continued to take risk. Moreover, when they had just entered the mountains, the nobles had not abandoned their luxurious carriages. Such a conspicuous outfit would naturally attract the attention of the bandit. Although there were 200 to 300 cavalrymen accompanying them, in the eyes of the bandits, it was not considered too many. It was just the standard of a caravan. Some small bandit groups would not dare to touch such a scale, but it was the favorite of large bandit group. Moreover, in such a complicated terrain, the number of people was not the most important thing. Tang En and Josiah were well aware of this situation. However, they had returned this time with only a few high-ranking officials. They could not be in 2 places at once, so they could only report the situation to the nobles through Philip's mouth. The nobles still valued their lives very much. After hearing the news, they very seriously explained it to the cavalrymen. However, as the saying went, rats have their ways. The cavalrymen who acted as scouts were a branch of the royal guard. They had never left the capital, let alone been to the north. Therefore, they did not understand the despicable methods of the bandit. Finally, when the group passed through a canyon that they had already checked, they were ambushed by the bandit. Fortunately, Tangen had been vigilant and discovered that something was wrong in advance. He had loudly warned the group so that they did not completely step into the trap. After a few rounds of arrow rain, they retreated in time. Other than losing a dozen cavalrymen in this battle, no nobles were hurt. However, there was no doubt that looking at the cavalrymen and carriages that had been shot like arrows still left a very bad impression on Simpson and the others. The possibility of bandits is not high. Tang En met the gaze of Josiah and the others and shook his head. This terrain was similar to a cliff, but this cliff was indeed a little short. It was less than 3 meters high, so it should be considered a ditch. The place where there was chaos was opposite the ditch, where the cavalrymen who had gone to scout ahead were. Although the terrain here was difficult to walk on, it was not considered a dangerous place. There was also no cover, so even bandits would not be interested in this place. The group's doubts did not last long. Soon, a cavalryman ran over and reported that they had bumped into a group of Brand patrolling soldiers. Brand soldiers? This time, Simpson reacted quickly. His face was filled with ecstasy. He threw away the wooden stick and rushed forward. We're here, we're finally here. Ha ha. Looking at Simpson, who was dancing and running quickly, Tang En and the other 2 could not help but curl their lips. Is this the legendary can't walk? Are you kidding me? However, although they were complaining in their hearts, they still looked relieved. The appearance of the Brand regular soldiers here could only mean that they were sent by the Blank's army to patrol. After all, in addition to preparing for battle, they also had to take on the task of preventing the Grey Coat Army from escaping. Oh right, brother. Looking at the chaotic scene opposite them, Tang En asked casually, "Why are you guys arguing?" The cavalryman spread his hands helplessly. They said that the battlefield ahead is a restricted area, and they won't let us get close. They told us to go back the way we came. You guys didn't reveal your identities? This negotiation was added at the last minute, and they could not be exposed. Naturally, it was impossible to inform this army in time. However, as long as Ronald and the others met the general and revealed their identities, all the problems would naturally be solved. The cavalryman looked even more depressed. He pointed to his chest. I told them that I've even mentioned your titles, but they didn't believe me. Tangan and the others were stunned. Then, they looked at the dusty face of the cavalryman and his armor that was covered in holes and scratches. They immediately knew the answer. Regardless of their combat strength, the Royal Guards were still very famous. Every year, a group of outstanding soldiers would be selected from each legion to enter the capital and be assigned to this sequence. For ordinary soldiers, as long as they entered the Royal Guards, it meant that they would live a carefree life and have a bright future. Therefore, as long as they were brand soldiers, they would definitely know. And now, the soldiers opposite them did not believe it because of this reason. For example, this was equivalent to listening to all kinds of praises and promotions before a blind date. They would imagine that the other party was tall, rich, handsome, or something like that. However, when the other party really appeared in front of them, they would find that he was a typical loser. This kind of disillusionment naturally brought about a strong sense of disbelief. Thinking of this, Tang En and the others simultaneously looked at Simpson, who was nimbly crossing the ditch. It seemed that this person's image was not much better. On the other side of the ditch, the quarrel continued. And as the anger rose, weapons were raised from time to time. How dare you? Do you know who you're blocking? Isn't it just the Royal Guards? Haha. It's not that I want to criticize you, but if you want to get away with it, you should at least change your attire. That's right, and this is a military area. I don't care who you are, hurry up and get out of here. How dare you? Are you blind? There are many marquises and earls waiting behind you. Do you want to die? Oh, I'm so scared, I'm so scared. Go away. If you dare to be long-winded again, my sword won't have eyes. You still dare to fight? Try and move. He's too damn arrogant, beat him up. Let's see who dares to move. Motherf *Cur go. Beat these bastards to death. The chaos escalated quickly, and it seemed that a fight was unavoidable. Fortunately, Simpson had already crossed the ditch at this time. Seeing that the situation was tense, he hurriedly shouted, "Stop, all of you, stop!" His orders were absolutely effective on the Royal Guard. Thus, the crowd that had just come into contact with Simpson immediately separated again. However, during this period of time, a few of the cavalrymen were at a disadvantage. After all, the soldiers did not know who Simpson was, so naturally, they took advantage of him. Seeing this scene, Simpson's face darkened, and he quickly walked over. "Damn it, who's your leader?" "It's me." "Where did you come from, old man?" A small captain walked out from the patrol. Hearing Simpson's unfriendly tone, he naturally did not treat him well. "How dare you?" Simpson almost choked on his anger at this "where did he come from?" question. His old face instantly turned red. "I'm Marquis Simpson, you—" "Oh ho!" Interrupted, the small captain opened his mouth in shock. He looked up and down at Simpson's tramp appearance and laughed. "Marquis? Haha. This is King interesting, you're acting more and more like it. Oh right, what's your name again? Do you want me to bow to you, haha." Simpson had never been humiliated like this before. The corner of his mouth twitched continuously, and his outstretched fingers kept trembling, as if he was about to have a stroke. You lowly commoner, you're dead, you." Before he could think of a new curse word, a fist kept expanding in his vision, bang. "What about you, you old dog, you'd better get lost." It was the small captain who was tired of being scolded. He threw a punch and gave Simpson a panda eye. The scene suddenly became quiet, and the cavalrymen on the Royal Guard's side were dumbfounded. They never thought that the Marquis would be beaten up, so they all stood there in a daze and did not react at all. "Ah! What are you idiots standing there for? Kill them for me, kill them all!" Chapter 451. A lion disguised as a poodle to approach a flock of sheep, only to be scratched by a sheepdog. This sounded funny, but it was a true portrayal of Simpson's situation. The hierarchy in this strange world was very strict. As a marquis, Simpson would never have thought that he would be beaten up by a lowly soldier one day. In a fit of anger, he roared and ordered the cavalry to attack. The chaos by the ditch eventually turned into a battle. The 200 cavalrymen of the Royal Guard crossed the ditch and almost annihilated the soldiers on the spot. Some of the soldiers saw that the situation was not good and quickly turned to flee while sending out signals for help. In a short while, a large number of soldiers rushed in from all directions and surrounded the negotiation team. But at this point, the matter was easily resolved. The officers of the battalion were more observant than the lowly soldiers. Although the nobles were all dressed like beggars, they still had a faint sense of dignity. They did not dare to act rashly and directly chose to report to their superiors. Finally, when the general of this army arrived in person and showed a look of fear and trepidation, the chaos by the ditch finally subsided. What happened next was simple. The negotiation team arrived at the place where the two sides were facing each other. Ronald and the other nobles had been running all the way and were severely exhausted. Naturally, they could not immediately start the negotiations, so they stayed to rest at Blank's army. Josiah and the rest were anxious to return home. They crossed the battlefield and walked towards the camp of the Grey-Coat Army. From the beginning, in this war that had yet to break out, the Grey-Coat Army had held the initiative. Whether it was the previous 3 victories or the sudden stop to set up camp, it was all based on the will of the Grey-Coat Army. Since this was chosen by the Grey-Coat Army, they naturally had an advantage in terms of terrain. In fact, this was exactly the case. The Grey-Coat Army's camp was built on a gentle mound, slightly higher than the camp of Blank's army. This slight advantage of height was not to be underestimated. In war, it represented a wider commanding field of vision for the general and the accumulated strength of the soldiers when they charged. Tang En and the rest did not go up the mountain directly. Instead, they tidied up their appearance in a small forest ravine beside the mound. Previously, when they were traveling with the nobles, they had brought along camouflage items. Now that they were returning to the camp, they naturally had to remove them first to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. However, just as everyone was happily chatting and taking off the props on their faces, Tang En's eyes suddenly flashed. Then, he quietly took a step forward and arrived behind Dave and the others. He then lowered his body and hid behind the big tree beside him. These few movements were as natural and smooth as flowing water. Even Josiah and the others did not notice that Tang En had disappeared right under their noses in this short period of time. When he reappeared, Tang En was already behind a shrub that was half a man's height dozens of meters away. In front of him, 2 people in black were crawling under the grayish-yellow plant's root. At this time, the 2 of them were leaning forward to observe Josiah and the others. Obviously, they did not expect that someone behind them was also looking at them with an inquisitive gaze. Scout? Tang En guessed the most likely possibility. However, he still had some doubts in his heart because these 2 people gave him a sense of familiarity. Not in their appearance, but in their demeanor. On the surface, it seemed that the 2 of them were observing, but in fact, one of them was slightly shaking his head. His attention was focused on the surrounding environment. This was a kind of tactical cooperation. One person was monitoring and the other was assisting, combined with some small gestures. It was a bit like the style of the gray space. Could it be that they were the new recruits of Michio? Tang En pinched his chin and guessed. Then, he shook his head lightly and stepped on a dead branch. Bang! The sound wasn't loud, but it was like a clap of thunder in the ears of the 2 men in black. Their bodies shook violently, and they didn't have time to turn around. They quickly pounced to the sides, their daggers flipped out, and the blade light wrapped around their bodies. Looking at the two slightly shocked faces, Tang En touched his nose and confirmed that they were not the first or second members of the gray space. Just as he was about to open his mouth to ask, he didn't expect that after the two men stomped on the ground, they would thrust their daggers forward and attack him with the force of thunder. Damn, so straightforward. Tang En grinned and raised his hands to meet the dagger, as if he wanted to slap it away. The two men in black reacted quickly. Their eyes flashed with a trace of light. When the daggers came into contact with Tang En's wrist, they quickly rotated their daggers at the same time. They changed from stabbing to wiping and instantly cut towards the artery on Tang En's wrist. The timing of this change was quite good, and it was done in an instant. There was no time for Tang En to react. The two daggers smoothly cut into Tang En's wrist. However, it seemed to be too smooth. The daggers directly cut through Tang En's wrist. It seemed that the whole hand was cut off. Of course, this was not the effect that the two men in black expected. Their eyes were filled with doubt, but it was immediately replaced by fear. Because there was no blood spurting out from Tang En's wrist. Ha! With a chuckle, Tang En's figure appeared behind the two men in black like a ghost. His hands grabbed their shoulders and his feet kicked their knees. He simply put the two men on the ground. Bang, bang. The two men fell face down into the soil at the same time. Their arms holding the daggers were locked behind their backs, and they could not move. You are Michio. And before he finished speaking, Tang En suddenly frowned, because the two black-clothed men, despite being locked up, actually forcefully flipped their left arms and slashed towards his neck like whips. Normally, their arms were naturally not long enough to reach Tang En. They had to move half of their body to do so. Once they did so, their locked right arms were very likely to be broken. Tang En also did not expect the two expressionless men in black to be so brave and decisive. Sure enough, the two right arms below the shoulders were a little twisted. It was obvious that they were dislocated. If they used more force, they would be broken. Tang En frowned and got up. He avoided the machete and took a few steps back. The two men in black quickly turned over and stared at Tang En indifferently. They did not have the slightest intention to check their injured arms. Spreading out his hands, Tang En asked, "Is your Captain David? Or Michio?" "Captain Michio. Who are you?" The man in black on the right asked in a slightly surprised tone. "So it's really a gray space." Tang En touched his forehead speechlessly. He did not expect to be beaten up as soon as he came back. He touched his nose and said, "Tang En." "Boss?" When Tang En returned to his original appearance, the two men in black finally confirmed that the person in front of them was their boss. There was a trace of fear and uneasiness on their originally expressionless faces. However, of course, Tang En did not blame the two men. He asked around a little and found out that they were indeed the third batch of members recruited by Michio. They were now undergoing actual combat training and were patrolling around the camp. Seeing that the two men were a little nervous, Tang En did not ask any more questions. Together with Josiah and the others, they went to the Gray Coat Army's camp. With these two leading the way, there would naturally be no problems. Not long after they entered the main entrance of the camp, Rosa, who had received the news, came over with the higher-ups and welcomed them in with a happy face. Because of the sudden arrival, there was naturally no welcome ceremony. However, Josiah's name in the Gray Coat Army was still very famous. Soon, there were many cheering soldiers on both sides of the road. Then, David, Michio, Fry and other familiar faces appeared one by one. However, it was obviously not the time to talk, so Tang En just said a simple greeting and entered the tent with everyone. After sitting down, naturally, there was a warm exchange of greetings. Rosa directly pulled Josiah to sit next to him and did not mention the negotiation. They talked about reuniting after parting. This situation lasted for about half an hour before gradually turning to the main topic. Josiah first explained the general situation of the negotiation, then took out the conditions that had been negotiated and explained in detail one by one. It should be said that Josiah and the others' negotiation this time was very successful. The results of the negotiation were even more unexpected. One must know that although Rosa and the others had put forward a lot of conditions before, that was just a negotiation tactic. They also knew that some of the conditions would be impossible to agree to, so they specifically made a note to not force things. But now, in the negotiation results, all the easy conditions were achieved. Some of the difficult conditions were not a problem. Even some of the conditions that they thought should not be forced were successful. Although some of the conditions were different in form from what they had expected, the actual results were similar. If just based on the results in front of them, Josiah and the others had undoubtedly made a great contribution. The results were amazing. As the conditions were announced one by one, the atmosphere in the tent continued to heat up. It was a warm and festive atmosphere. Rosa's excited words and Meng's heroic laughter almost never stopped. However, after Tang En finished greeting everyone around him, he sensitively noticed that there were some strange undercurrents in this seemingly warm atmosphere. This time, the Grey Coat Army had mobilized the army and brought most of the high-ranking ministers. Although these ministers were all smiling now, nearly half of them were smiling very reluctantly. Looking at Rosa, who was a little overjoyed, Tang En nodded thoughtfully. He did not seem too surprised. This situation had been expected a long time ago. Not everyone had Rosa's vision and vision. Most of the high-ranking officials were born poor. Because of the limitations of subjective objectivity, they could only see the good situation in front of them. There was no doubt that Rosa's decision this time was somewhat risky. Before the test of time, no one could be sure whether it was right or wrong. Because of this, she was naturally under a lot of pressure. However, now that Josiah had brought back the results of the negotiations, it undoubtedly allowed her to breathe a sigh of relief. However, this atmosphere did not last long. When Josiah mentioned Ronald's conditions, which were 3 parliamentary votes in addition to the previous conditions in exchange for the disbandment of the Grey Coat Army, the tent suddenly fell silent, followed by fierce and loud objections. Many of the ministers slammed the table and stood up. Their faces were full of anger as they scolded the nobles for being unkind. Only Rosa, Meng, Bosco, and a few other ministers chose to remain silent and think. In fact, from Tang En's point of view, these ministers who were fiercely objecting might not know what they were objecting to. Or rather, they were just scolding with wishful thinking and had never thought of how to solve the problem. Of course, this had little to do with Tang En. In the end, he just sat there with a bored look on his face, yawning, and listening to the slang that came from all over the place. Chapter 452. The next day morning. When Tang En suddenly opened his eyes, his gaze was still clear and cold, but his head was a little dizzy. Turning his head, he saw a big man carrying a basin of water with both hands, using his foot to lift the curtain and walk in. David? Oh, I'm back at the Grey Coat Army camp. David probably felt his gaze, so he raised his head and laughed. Haha, boss, you're awake. Well, Fry, Titan, and the others are too much. Isn't it just a promotion? They're so arrogant and brought so many people over. They're obviously trying to get boss drunk. Cough, cough, look at my stupid mouth. Boss, this is cold water. Do you want to wash your face to clear your head? Drinking. Looking at the pointed top of the tent, Tang En finally remembered what happened yesterday. Yesterday afternoon, in the tent, the division heads were busy scolding and didn't come up with anything valuable. In the end, Rosa waved his hand and signaled Tang En, Josiah, and the others who just came back to rest. As soon as Tang En came out, he was surrounded by the members of the Grey Space and Fry. The latter said that they had found a place to drink, and then they escorted him there. They were all friends, and it was a reunion after a long time, so Tang En naturally couldn't refuse. But when he arrived, he couldn't help but feel bitter. He knew he had been tricked. It turned out that Fry and Titon had made a few more contributions while Tangan was away. They were no longer team leaders or company leaders, but battalion-level officers leading 300 people. The so-called drinking place was actually an open space on a hill. Other than the rows of wine barrels, there were hundreds of people waiting there with such a lineup, not to mention Tangan, even a person at the level of a wine jar would kneel down. Tangan couldn't remember who was who. As long as someone raised a glass in front of him, he would subconsciously pick up the glass and drink it until he completely blacked out. Damn, don't let me get the chance. As he cursed Fry and the others, Tangan rubbed his head and got up. He looked at David, who was trying to please him, and raised his eyebrows. "You don't look drunk." "Of course not. Tui. No, I was pretty drunk last night too. I just got up. Really, if you don't believe me, you can smell me, I still smell of alcohol." Hurriedly changing his tone, David, with an innocent face, grabbed his sleeves and said solemnly, "Oh? Is that so?" Of course, Tangan didn't buy it. In terms of acting skills and disguise, David was indeed too inexperienced. He glanced at him and said, "Then why do I clearly remember that you were in the drinking party last night?" "Well..." David was stunned on the spot. Rolling his eyes quickly, he put on a fawning posture. "Boss, that was not my intention. I wanted to drink for you at first. Well, it was Fry and the others who instigated it. They are the culprits." Nodding, Tangan looked at David and said thoughtfully, "It turns out that you are here." Last night, Tangan was so drunk that he blacked out. Unless he entered the system space to check the replay, how could he remember that someone had advised him to drink? Knowing that he had been tricked, David was dumbfounded. Then, he slapped his forehead and felt depressed. If he had known that his boss was so cunning, he wouldn't have been so easily fooled. Splash! Tangan didn't have time to care about David. He splashed water on his face a few times. The water in the northern winter was very cold, and he instantly felt refreshed. In the end, he simply bent over and buried his entire head in the icy water. Waves of coldness stimulated him from all angles. It was very refreshing, and the dizziness from before instantly disappeared. After tidying up and changing their clothes, Tangan and David walked out of the tent. The sun was already high up in the sky. Although there was no warmth, the gloomy light still tried to show its existence, shining light to every corner. This was a military camp, not the City of Dawn. Naturally, there were no civilians in the Greycoat Army. Instead, there were armored soldiers coming and going, changing shifts and patrolling. From time to time, soldiers could be seen walking as if they were flying, as if they were going to pass on some orders. Those who didn't have any duties were much more lazy. They gathered in groups of 3 to 5, and distributed their homemade cigarette. They chatted and joked about the new recruits, and from time to time, they would burst into laughter. Everyone has been practicing the battle energy application skills that Uncle Zwafan taught us every day, and our strength has improved a lot. I'm now at the peak of the intermediate level, and I feel like I'm going to break through soon. Luke has also reached the intermediate level, and the rest are about the same. Oh, Harry is the laziest, so he's only at the beginning of the intermediate level. Well, Michaud's strength is the highest, probably higher than mine. He's probably at the advanced level, but we haven't practiced together for a long time, so I don't know the details. By the way, the group of soldiers that trained Titon was disbanded. Did we talk about this last night? Maybe it's because they can't replicate the gray space. But they're doing pretty well now. The best is naturally Big Bro Titon. He's a battalion commander. Most of the others are company captains. Some came last night, some didn't come because they were on a mission, and a few died in the previous battle. Oh, and there's also little Carol. Because we didn't know if there would be a fight this time, we didn't let her come. We left her in Dawn City, and a few of our old brothers are looking after her. She's still as cold and quiet as ever, but her strength has improved very quickly. When she came out, she was almost at the intermediate level. She made us feel a little ashamed, haha. Right, something else happened, and it was pretty big. David followed behind Tang En, constantly talking about important matters. What is it? Tang En raised an eyebrow at the mention of little Carol. Scratching his head, David continued, Officer Mazel, have you heard of Boss? He's the head of the Weapons and Equipment Department. I haven't. It's like this. Officer Mazel has a son, but I can't remember his name. He's in his 20s, and he's very frivolous. He usually doesn't do anything serious. One night, he drank too much, and on his way home, he bumped into a woman. That woman was quite pretty. That brat had a flirtatious mouth, so he pressed her down and groped her a few times, but he didn't do anything. Later on, he was dragged away by the people who were drinking with him. Hey boss, you know that the army is forbidden from harassing civilians in the base, let alone this sort of thing. In the past, someone was even beheaded. But that brat had a good father, and he didn't really go that far. That woman demanded an apology several times, but to no avail. In the end, she could only give up. Originally, this matter should have been left unsettled, but that woman had a little brother, about 7 or 8 years old. Boss, you know that little Carol is the queen of the children in the base, so this matter was passed on to her. Tsk. He smacked his lips and sighed. That night, little Carol brought a knife and snuck into Mazel's home. Mazel is still a high-ranking officer in the army, and his home has quite a few guards, but little Carol still managed to sneak in and find that brat on the bed. After binding his hands and feet and gagging his mouth, little Carol raised her knife and cut off that brat's hands and that thing. After a pause, he grinned. Speaking of which, little Carol's thoughts are quite meticulous. After doing this, she took advantage of the fact that the kid fainted from the pain and quietly came out again. The next day during training, she didn't do anything out of the ordinary. She did it beautifully and didn't leave any traces. As for that brat, because his mother happened to be looking for him, he was able to discover what was going on and didn't die from blood loss. Moreover, little Carol was wearing a mask at the time, so not even he knew who had done it. This matter came to light several days later. That woman's little brother accidentally blurted it out. He's just a child, so he doesn't know how to keep secret. It was only then that we learned that little Carol was the culprit. Tsk. Mazel's family naturally wouldn't let this go. After all, he was their only eldest son. They could cut off his hands and feet, but if they cut off his hands and feet, they would have no hope of continuing the family line, haha. They immediately sent people to arrest little Carol, but in the end, we sent them back. Haha, I really don't know what to say about this. It was originally an apology. After all, that brat didn't go that far. This matter blew up, and in the end, it reached Chief Luosha. At the time, we were already prepared to send little Carol out of the 100,000 mountains to find the boss if the situation changed. But in the end, the chief suppressed this matter. First, he had that brat apologize to that woman, and then little Carol to apologize to that brat. This was a great advantage, but little Carol wasn't willing to apologize and wouldn't listen to anyone. In the end, we found someone about the same height as little Carol from the surrounding villages, disguised him, and sent him to apologize. In the end, the matter was resolved. As for that Mazel, we investigated his background and found some evidence of his corruption. We gave it to Fei Rue and he was promoted in the army. At this point, David laughed and shook his head. Haha, after this matter, little Carol has become famous. Those fellows in the base who have some sort of connection with her now avoid her. Tang En thoughtfully nodded. He could understand little Carol's intense actions. She had seen her mother defiled by bandits, so she naturally loathed this sort of thing. He softly chuckled and said, it seems like I'll have to find a time to thank Chief Luosha. After a pause, he asked, "Right, where's Michaud?" "He should be training those new recruits on the western side of the camp." Should I send someone to call him over?" Tang Yen waved his hand and said, "There's no need. We'll go together." David paused, a hesitant look on his face. "Boss, why don't you go?" "I won't go." Tang Yen turned and frowned at David. Chapter 453. Boss, Michaud has changed a little. I can't tell you the details, but it feels weird. I don't want to talk behind people's backs, but Harry, Luke, and the others all have the same feeling. They said that Michaud seems to be blinded by hatred and killing intent. From time to time, Tang Yen nodded and smiled in response to the soldiers passing by. David's words lingered in his mind as he walked to the west of the camp alone. Tang Yen had already learned about Michaud's change from the information he had received before. At that time, he didn't care about it, but now it seemed that there was really some trouble. But no matter what, Tang Yen couldn't let anything happen to the gray space. This was the foundation of his revenge. David and Michaud were the first to follow him, and now they had become the pillars of the gray space. Because of David's personality, he wasn't suitable to be an assassin. In the end, he became an attacker. As for Michaud, whether it was his fighting style or his way of doing things, he was greatly influenced by him. Tang Yen also admired him very much. Whether it was the early team building, the later work of the gray space's intelligence analysis, and so on, he was the one who led them step by step. Therefore, Tang Yen had to carefully consider Michaud's change, of course. No matter how big the trouble was, it was just trouble. Having faced many life and death situations together, Tang Yen didn't think that Michaud would do anything to harm the gray space. On the west side of the camp, as soon as Tang Yen arrived, a few people bowed to greet him. Tang Yen knew these people. They were the second batch of members of the gray space, who were later assigned to Michaud's command. After asking a little, Tang Yen learned that this place was a restricted area for the training of the new recruits of the gray space. The gray space's status in the Gray Coat Army was still strange. It enjoyed regimental treatment, but it was not included in the military establishment. Similarly, it was not under the jurisdiction of the administrative system. Instead, it was directly under Rosa. However, although its status was a little unclear, no one doubted the gray space's ability. The 1st Army Swordsman Regiment had been fooled by them from afar. In the previous battles, the Brand Scouts had not been able to find their way here. Moreover, even after being surrounded by Blank's army, they were still the ones who helped the soldiers break through the defense line and passed on the information. With such a valiant battle record, they were only going to be given a training ground. Naturally, they had to be satisfied. As they ventured deeper, the surrounding environment had obviously been modified. There were all kinds of strange terrains. This was also the usual training method of the gray space. When Tang Yen climbed up a slightly higher mound, his eyes suddenly opened up. An open space had been cleared below, and a maze-like tunnel had been dug. At this time, there were about hundreds of people chasing, escaping, and fighting. They were having a lot of fun. Boss, Michaud, who was closer to them, waved his hand and walked over. In the distance, several people who seemed to be supervising the battle quickly ran over. They were Luke and the other members of the first batch. The corners of Tang Yen's mouth curled up, and he greeted them with a smile. He had already learned some things from David. This time, not all of the gray space had come over. Harry and a few others were looking after little Carol in Dawn City. What made him especially happy was that the first batch of members who came over did not suffer any casualties in the previous battle. It was easy to die in war, no matter how strong one was. Therefore, such a result was naturally worth celebrating. After a round of vigorous greetings, Tang Yen realized that the people in front of him were the candidates for the 3rd batch of recruitment, and Luke and the others were invited by Michaud to train. "You recruited so many people?" After the greetings, Luke and the others went back to supervise the training again. On the hill, only Tang En and Michaud were left. Looking at the lively scene below, Tang En couldn't help but be a little surprised. Then, he asked doubtfully, "Hey, how long have you been training?" "They're all good." "Actually, we didn't train for long." Michaud pointed at the people below and explained with a chuckle, "When we were recruiting, the army had already left Dawn City. So, I reached an agreement with old Marshal Omeng. These people came voluntarily from the various legions, and they all have good foundations." "I see." Tang En nodded in realization, then raised his eyebrows. "What conditions did you promise him that old Marshal Omeng would let them go so easily?" It was no wonder that Tang En was puzzled. The army was independent and did not allow other forces to probe into it, let alone poach. The first 2 batches of members of the Gray Space were also ordinary people recruited from the encampment. For example, Luke was not accepted by the army because he had no sense of direction, so he ended up in the Gray Space. Michaud pursed his lips and chuckled, a hint of pride on his feminine face. "Actually, it's not a condition. We're in charge of providing training, and the army is in charge of sending people over. If you pass the training, you'll naturally be a member of the Gray Space. Of course, the passing rate is very low, so most of the people who don't pass can only be sent back to the army." After a pause, he continued, "Everyone saw the results of Big Brother Titan's soldiers that we trained in the past. So, even if these soldiers are sent back, their combat strength will be higher than their peers. We'll get members, and the army will get elite soldiers. This is a win-win cooperation, and old Marshal Omeng will naturally agree." "Beautiful!" Tang En couldn't help but praise as he rubbed his hands together. "As for the members who passed, we won't be careless. Right now, the attitude towards the Gray Space in the encampment is quite complicated. Some are envious and some are suspicious. So, we will collect all kinds of information about them one by one to ensure that their identities are clean." Nodding, Tang En patted Michaud's shoulder, and his expression was a little emotional. This was why Tang En admired Michaud. Under that seemingly feminine face, not only was there a delicate mind hidden, but there was also endless potential and a way of doing things without batting an eyelid. If it was someone else like David, they would never be able to come up with such a meticulous plan. After chatting for a while, Tang En pondered for a moment and decided to ask directly, "By the way, Michaud, did you find the bandits who killed your family?" "No. But I got some vague information. They are a group of bandits, not in the 100,000 mountains." Michaud paused for a moment, then shook his head and said, "It's good that you have news. Find time to find Josiah and ask the secret agency to help you find out. When you find them, take some people and go directly to destroy the bandit group." Pause for a while, Tang En looked at Michaud and chuckled, "Haha, otherwise the old brothers will be worried about you." "Well, thank you, boss." Michaud nodded happily, then looked at the battle below and spread his hands slightly. "Actually, I also know that I've been a little wrong recently. Some things have indeed been done, and David and the others have kindly reminded me. Well, in short, I'm sorry for them." Michaud's expression was a little sad when he said this. "Boss, do you know? Sometimes I don't even dare to close my eyes, because when I close my eyes, mother, father, uncle, and young sister, they are all around me, always around me. So I can only keep cultivating fighting spirit, physique, speed. Only by making myself the most tired can I not think about these things. This has increased my strength by quite a bit, and, when I first joined the Grey Coat Army, my personality was weak and my strength was low. They told me not to take revenge, and to live on my own. Now that I have some strength, they began to want me to take revenge. Kill those cruel bandits, kill everyone." Michaud's breathing was a little rapid, and his eyes flashed with a bloodthirsty light. He then closed his eyes and slowly exhaled a turbid breath. Huff, huff, haha, I've killed a lot of people. When people die, they die. There shouldn't be a soul. So, well, maybe they are all my imagination. I've been foolishly putting pressure on myself, and in the end, I transferred it to the enemy. It should be because of this that David and the others are uneasy. Tang En was silent. When he came, he planned to analyze it carefully and adjust Michaud's mentality of revenge. But who would have thought that Michaud would say it himself, and in a more thorough and detailed way? He found the root of the problem. What else could he say? Boss, I understand your and David's intentions. Michaud clenched his fists and nodded cautiously. I'll be careful in the future. Maybe after we kill the bandits, this won't happen again. Okay. Tang En nodded slightly. Since Michaud had already realized it, there was no need to say anything more. At this time, Luke and the others walked over. Behind them, hundreds of depressed and excited soldiers stood neatly in two teams. Ha, boss, Michaud, what are you talking about? This time, the first team won again. Michaud, there are indeed a few good seedlings in this team. They're not bad, and the key is that they're wretched enough. They're very suitable for the style of our gray space. Haha. Bah. I think it's suitable for you. We've always been very serious. They had all experienced life and death together, and were the first batch of team members who had crawled out of the mine. Naturally, Luke and the others had an extraordinary relationship with Tang En, and they gathered together happily. Of course, they seemed to be careless, but in fact, they had chosen the right time. They knew about Michaud's current state and were secretly worried about him. Now that Tang En had come back to talk, they naturally wouldn't disturb him while he was talking. After a while, Michaud chuckled and pointed at the soldiers who were secretly looking at them. He said to Tang En, Boss, do you want to say something? Many people here admire you very much. Tang En looked up and felt a chill in his heart. He waved his hand and said, Forget it. It's like giving a speech under the national flag on Monday. Cough cough. It's like an army pledging to go to war. It's too high profile. That's right, Luke said with a smile. These are all reckless men. It's useless to talk about them. It's better to let Boss go up and fight them alone. It's more effective than anything else, haha. F***ck, your stupid idea is too high profile. But I like it, hee hee. That's way too depressing. It's going to leave a shadow in their hearts. Why don't we let Boss and Michaud fight? I guarantee it'll be an eye-opener for them. Hey, that's a good idea. It's not easy for you to be so smart. Luke looked at the person in surprise. Then, he said to Tang En, Boss, you haven't taught us anything in a long time. This time, let's open our eyes. F***ck, so you're not the one who's being taught. Michaud grinned and sighed helplessly. Then, he pursed his lips and said, You guys have opened your eyes and I'm going to embarrass myself. Well, speaking of which, I really miss it. Forget it. Boss, are you interested in giving me some pointers? As soon as he finished speaking, Michaud's eyes flashed. Although his face was as calm as ever, a strong desire to fight had already risen. Tang En rubbed his nose and shrugged. Since it's like this, then let's see how strong you are now. F***ck. You're really going to fight? Quick, quick. Clear the place, clear the place. Chapter 454. Instead of clearing the area, Luke and the others retreated to where the soldiers were and used the top of the mound as a battlefield. Although the place was a little small, Luke and the others knew that the two men didn't need much space or time to fight. It wasn't that they were looking down on Michaud, but that Michaud's fighting style was almost the same as Tang En's. They both liked to fight in narrow spaces with short daggers. The soldiers who had just finished their battle didn't leave. They circled around and looked at the two people on the mound in confusion. Of course, they knew Michaud. They also knew what kind of demonic training methods and terrifying skills this feminine young man had. As for the other person, the training here was closed. If he wanted to leave, He had to become a member of the gray space or be sent back to his original army. Thus, they didn't know that Tang En had returned. Of course, some of them had seen Tang En before, but it had to be said that Tang En's ordinary face really didn't have any sense of existence. However, this situation didn't last long. After a bold soldier asked Tang En about it, his identity spread among the soldiers. Instantly, the gazes of the soldiers became abnormally fervent. It should be said that Tang En's image in the Gray Coat Army was mixed. Those who praised him thought that he had pulled the Gray Coat Army out of their predicament by himself and created the perverted team called the Gray Space. He could be called a hero. Those who despised him thought that he was selfish and undisciplined, ruthless, and wouldn't even let his own people go. He was really scum. Of course, most people didn't have any obvious opinions. They just thought that Tang En was mysterious, low-key, and strong, but had a bad temper. Since these soldiers were able to participate in the Gray Space's training, they naturally didn't dislike Tang En. In fact, most of them were here for Tang En. Like Michaud said earlier, they admired Tang En a lot and hoped to obtain such glory. After a while, the two people's clothes fluttered, but they didn't move at all. A few soldiers quietly approached Luke and the others. Instructor Luke, why haven't we started yet? What do you know?" Luke narrowed his eyes and cursed in disdain. Biting the stem of the grass, he said casually, "Do you think this is a wrestling match? In a battle between experts, momentum was the most important thing. If the enemy didn't move, then so would I. If the enemy moves, how is it? One strike, one kill." Using his fingers as a blade, he abruptly slashed down. "Don't blame me for not reminding you. Keep your eyes open, because victory or defeat might be decided in an instant." "Oh, I know. As expected of Instructor Luke, you see further and more clearly than us ignorant people. That's right." Since Instructor Luke was able to see through all this, he's naturally an expert. Luke narrowed his eyes in enjoyment as the soldiers fawned over him and showered him with compliments. Finally, there was some movement from the two people up there. Spreading his hands, Tang En was a little puzzled. "Michaud, why aren't you attacking? Have you forgotten that it's most important for a melee fighter to seize the initiative? Well, I'm the boss after all. Are you sure you want me to make the first move?" "Well..." Michaud was stunned for a moment. He then scratched his head in embarrassment. "Boss, I wouldn't dare make the first move if you didn't tell me." Cough, cough. A series of coughs came from below the hill, and Luke lowered his head so much that it almost went into his pant. The soldiers next to him tactfully looked away, as if they hadn't heard what he had just said. The people who were in the same batch as Luke weren't so kind. They all gave Luke a thumbs up and praised him for his foresight with gloating expressions. Tang En and Michaud looked down in confusion, then withdrew their gazes. Waving his hand, Tang En said, "Come on." Michaud nodded silently. With a flip of his right hand, he took out his dagger and circled around Tang En in small step. Tang En didn't turn around. He still stood there quietly, and didn't even take out his dagger. Michaud certainly didn't think that Luke was underestimating him. Or rather, even if Luke was underestimating him, it was only natural. He was currently the strongest person in the gray space, but it was precisely because of this that he was increasingly aware of how terrifying his boss was. After circling around, Michaud gradually slowed down, and his breathing became steadier. He wasn't observing Tang En to see if he had any openings. Michaud didn't think that he had reached such a level. He was simply adjusting himself so that he could make a move when he was at the peak of his strength. When he circled behind Tang En again, Michaud's eyes flashed. "Now's the time." He stepped forward, bent his body and rushed forward. Whoosh! In the blink of an eye, he flashed to Tang En's side and spat out his dagger. Ding! With a light sound, Tang En didn't move from his original position, but his body had turned around at some point. He raised his dagger and accurately pointed it at the edge of the dagger. Michaud naturally didn't expect this attack to be effective, even if it was at the peak of his strength. He slid forward, and before his figure disappeared, his real body flashed to the left like a ghost. His dagger flashed and disappeared in a flash, lightly sweeping towards Tang En's neck. Without waiting for the result, Michaud changed his position again and attacked again. In a short period of time, a torrent of attacks poured down like a torrential downpour. Ding, ding, ding. In comparison, Tang En's response was very simple. He simply turned his body and swung his dagger to parry the attacks. His body wasn't slow, and his dagger wasn't slow either. However, compared to Michaud, who created a series of afterimages, Michaud's movements were a little slow and clumsy. His every move was clearly reflected in everyone's eyes. Seeing that the outcome of the battle wasn't going to be decided in one move, a soldier asked hesitantly, "Instructor. Instructor Luke, is Boss Twain, is he on the defensive?" Luke's eyes didn't leave the top of the hill. His fingers were trembling as if he was holding a dagger and attacking. The only difference was the speed of his movements. You know. Well, Boss isn't using his full strength. He's not attacking. No, Boss doesn't plan to end the battle immediately. He's letting Michaud attack with all his strength. F***ck. Luke's fingers paused, and he waved his hand helplessly. I still can't catch up with him. Michaud is getting scarier and scarier. Well, don't focus on Boss. The gap is too big, and you won't be able to learn anything. Pay more attention to Michaud. Pay attention to his figure when he attacks, the speed of his dagger, and the angle. Well, forget it. You won't understand even if I explain it to you now. Remember as much as you can. If you can't, well, just watch the show. The soldier scratched his head and tried to look at Michaud, but his eyes were dazzled in an instant. He couldn't tell which was the real body and which was the illusion. Strange. Why was Boss Tang En able to block Michaud's dazzling attacks even though his movements were so slow? On the hill, Tang En couldn't help but sigh as he dealt with Michaud's fast attacks. Luke's analysis was right. Tang En didn't plan to attack. Instead, he wanted to see how much Michaud had improved. Judging from the current situation, even though he had already expected it, Michaud still gave him a big surprise. Michaud's hand speed was very fast. Tang En also knew that this was a gift from his talent. Talent was just like birth. There was no room for choice. However, having talent didn't mean having everything. It could quickly weaken with laziness, but it could also become more amazing with hard work. Michaud was undoubtedly the latter. Not only was he constantly developing his talent for hand speed, but he was also improving his movement speed and combat awareness to make better use of his talent. It was easy to say, but the hardships involved were not to be underestimated. Take Tang En for example. He had trained hard in the system space, but when he was at the same level as Michaud, his attack speed was definitely not as fast as Michaud's. Michaud's performance had already amazed Tang En, but he didn't think that this was Michaud's limit. He paused, and a crack appeared in the impenetrable defense. Michaud's attack went straight for the center of the center. Michaud's eyes flashed, and he didn't hesitate to cut in. His dagger suddenly glowed with a green light. If Tang En was amazed by Michaud's performance, then Tang En was only left with pressure. Although the battle didn't last long, Michaud's consciousness was completely immersed in it. He didn't hesitate to drill in as soon as he saw a flaw. He didn't even think about whether it was a trap. The green light appeared suddenly, and the subsequent changes happened in an instant. It gathered and contracted like a green grain, then suddenly exploded. The blade light spun rapidly in the narrow space, wantonly attacking. This was the first time Michaud had used his combat energy in a battle, but the momentum was like a gentle river suddenly meeting a 1,000-foot waterfall. Messy flowers. This was the first thought that appeared in Tang En's mind. Then, he rejected it, and the word good slipped out of his mouth. Tang En was naturally familiar with the flower confusion skill, and he taught the technique to Michaud and the others. But now, the martial skill that Mi Xiu used was like a chaotic flower, but the attack method was very different. There was no longer a thin blood-red saber light. Instead, there were countless leaf-breaking saber lights. It was obvious that Mi Xiu had tailor-made this technique for his unique hand speed. Of course, no matter how unpredictable Mi Xiu was, it was impossible for him to put Tang En in a difficult position. This was not a difference in strength, but a difference in realm. His long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly. His dagger drew a demonic bloody arc in the air, and he held it in front of his chest. Ding, ding, ding. Dense sounds of impact rang out like raindrops hitting banana leaf. The leaf blade lights were like moths darting into a flame as they entered the arc of blood light. After flickering for a moment, there were no waves. Mi Xiu retreated a dozen steps. His fingers trembled slightly, and his eyes regained their clarity. He turned around and looked at the stunned crowd below the hill. He shrugged and said, "Well, this is my strongest move. Well, I've made a fool of myself." Chapter 455. Author's Note: There's a power outage in my hometown again. I can't do anything about it. Okay, I'll post the next chapter first. Well, I can only try my best. Haha, we're so lucky to have a duel. When we get back, we'll definitely get to drink a lot. And it's between Boss Tang En and Captain Mi Xiu? TSK, it's just not fun. It would be even better if they could overturn rivers and seas. Overturn rivers and seas? Even a heaven stage warrior can't do that. Also, if you want to die, don't drag us down with you. If you do, we'll be the first ones to die. Haha, that's right. A large group of soldiers entered from the west side of the camp and headed toward the army's gathering point. The battle in the maze just now was a test of the Gray Space's training phase. As the losers, they naturally had to return to their respective units. Of course, it was hard to be eliminated, but they were still in a good mood after watching an exciting duel. Well, who do you think won just now? Do you even need to ask? Of course it's Boss Tang En. Well, I know Captain Mi Xiu was trained by Boss Tang En, but it's hard to say. Mi Xiu was the one who kept attacking, while Twain was the one who was passive. What do you mean passive? Didn't you hear what Instructor Luke said? That's because Boss Tang En didn't use his full strength. Yeah, didn't Captain Mi Xiu say that he made a fool of himself? And think about it, Captain Mi Xiu attacked for so long, but did he see Boss Tang En fight back? More importantly, he didn't even move from his original position. Well, now that you mention it, you're right. The scene suddenly became quiet. The soldiers stopped and looked at each other. They were all a little scared. Originally, they didn't have any contact with Tang En. In their minds, he was a legendary figure. But Mi Xiu was different. In the previous phase of training, they had witnessed the terrifying strength of the Gray Space's captain. Naturally, they had compared the two in their hearts, and they all thought that as the leader, Tang En should be stronger than Mi Xiu. However, he didn't know exactly how much higher it was. Basically, he estimated that it was slightly higher, but the difference shouldn't be too big. But now that they had seen the actual battle and were reminded of the situation back then, they were somewhat speechless. He was able to block Mi Xiu's crazy attacks without even moving an inch. This is a legend. After a while, one of the soldiers came back to his senses and shook his head in self-mockery. Forget it, don't think about it. That's not a realm that we can reach. Furthermore, we've all been eliminated. But to be able to witness this battle, we've already profited, haven't we? That's right. One shouldn't be too greedy. With the skills we've gained from this month's training, it's not impossible for us to become a squad leader when we return. Haha, that's enough. After the two of them spoke like this, the atmosphere instantly eased up and became lively once more. The Gray Space didn't recruit everyone. If they could participate in the training, it meant that they all had some potential. Although they were eliminated now, they were still inferior to the top, but they were still better than the bottom. Like the previous person said before, with the results of the training, they would be able to get an official position and pay. That would be a good result. Just as the soldiers returned to the barracks, a voice sounded. Haha, what are you talking about? You look so happy. Hello, sir. Hello, Deputy Commander Borg. The soldiers stopped laughing, stood up straight, and saluted one after another. In front of them was Borg, who looked quite handsome in his military uniform. Unlike before, the military insignia of the tactical department hung on his sleeve. Now, it was the insignia of the deputy commander. Borg looked at the soldiers who called out his name and hesitated for a moment. Are you from the First Army? Yes, Deputy Commander, we're second-class soldiers of the 3rd Swordsman Brigade. The soldiers didn't dare to neglect and reported loudly. Borg nodded and then asked casually, By the way, what were you talking about just now? The soldiers looked at each other and hesitated. They didn't know the relationship between Borg and Tang En, but they knew that Tang En had crushed Borg's uncle, Bolet's leg in front of the tactical department. In the end, he had forced Bolet to commit suicide. While they hesitated, the soldiers who didn't know what had happened told them. Tang En, Borg muttered and looked at the soldiers with his hands behind his back. His expression was calm, and he didn't show any signs of anger. He nodded and waved his hand to let them leave. After the soldiers entered the barracks, Borg closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His left fist behind his back slowly relaxed. He shook his head and walked towards the east. This wasn't the City of Dawn. Naturally, there were soldiers on the winding roads. Other than those who were patrolling, the rest of the soldiers greeted Borg with a military salute when they saw him. However, Borg seemed to be in a daze. He walked past them as if he didn't see them. Tang En. He muttered in his heart again. Borg frowned. His expression was complicated. Hatred, depression, bitterness, and so on flashed across his face. As a former noble, Borg had pride in his heart. Even though he had fallen into the Grey Coat Army, this pride didn't disappear. In fact, it grew because of the disparity between his companions. In fact, he had the right to be arrogant. Whether it was in the circle of nobles or among the children of the same age as the ministers of the Grey Coat Army, he was a dazzling existence. When he first joined, he relied on his good tactical skills to act as the commander of a team of hundreds of people. He also won a few small-scale battles. Later, when he was under the command of old Marshal Omeng, he was even more aggressive. He was praised repeatedly and his tactics were adopted several times. Finally, he was placed in the combat unit to receive the position of deputy commander. The position of deputy commander was naturally not low. Moreover, it was in the army. However, even so, everyone knew in their hearts that this kind of person who was directly put down from Omeng's side would definitely have a bright future. It could be said that Borg's great future was slowly unfolding. However, when he thought of Tang En's strength, needless to say, Borg himself had also given up. He definitely couldn't compare to him. Josiah? Alright, it seemed that the other party's chances were slightly higher than his. Deputy Commander. The Grey Space was a regimental establishment. Tang En was naturally the commander. This F***Kerr was suppressing him again. F***CK, F***CK, F***CK. Even though Borg had some dignity and shrewdness after constantly experiencing the battlefield, he still almost couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. He couldn't compare to anything. How could he play like this? Borg. Hold it in, Borg, hold it in. This is only temporary. The military rank will suppress him. Josiah will also be yours. Tang En will also be humiliated and killed by you. Borg. The raised tone finally pulled Borg out of his own world. When he looked up, his face was distorted and his eyes were blank. This overflowing murderous look made the person who greeted him slightly stunned. The hand that was about to reach out to him stopped in midair. Oh, third uncle! When Borg came back to his senses, he recognized that the person in front of him was his third uncle who had just returned, which was Enoch. He quickly took a step back and bowed slightly. Well, Borg, long time no see. After a pause, Enoch put away his stunned expression and took the opportunity to put his hand on Borg's shoulder. He smiled and said, Hee, I've heard all about it. You're really amazing. You've even become the deputy commander. Well, Big Brother and I are both old. The future of the family depends on you. Third uncle, you're exaggerating. Borg has only achieved a little. He really can't compare to you. I'm not exaggerating. As if he remembered something, Enoch's expression was a little bleak. He immediately hid it and said, By the way, just now are you okay? Oh, I just remembered something unhappy. But it's okay. I can handle it. Borg shook his head and showed a confident look. That's good. Let's go. I've just returned and I'm going to see Big Brother. Come with me. Borg was slightly stunned. At this moment, he realized that he was already in front of his father Bosco's tent. Enoch pulled him in and opened the curtain. You're here. Borg? The layout of the tent was very simple. Bosco was sitting at the table and holding a simple pottery bowl while drinking tea. When he saw Borg behind Enoch, he raised his eyebrows and was a little surprised. Father. Borg bowed slightly respectfully. Enoch greeted his big brother and then pulled Borg to sit on both sides. He explained, I met Borg outside just now, so I brought him in. Big brother, Borg has grown up and is completely capable of standing on his own. I think there are some things that we don't have to hide from him anymore. Bosco put down the pottery bowl and glanced at Borg, who was pouring tea. His eyelids drooped and he didn't speak, which naturally meant that he agreed. There were 3 bowls of tea on the rough wooden table. Although the tea wasn't tasty, the 3 of them were of noble birth, and some etiquette habits, such as not speaking before drinking tea, were deeply ingrained in their bones. Therefore, the tent was quiet because of this. After taking a sip of tea, Enoch smacked his lips twice and said, Big brother, my intelligence authority in the secret agency has basically been taken away. Even though Bosco was shrewd, he was still shocked by Enoch's first sentence. His expression changed and he frowned. What's going on? Borg was still calm, mainly because he didn't react in time. Then, he slowly remembered that his third uncle was involved in the secret agency in order to give the family the intelligence authority of the secret agency. Shaking his head, Enoch smiled bitterly. To put it simply, it's because of the matter with the bounty hunters that Tang En went to Mountain Creek City, which is the headquarters of the secret agency. Then, the intelligence authority that I painstakingly planned was taken away by Josiah. Tang En again? Borg cried out involuntarily. His body trembled and the tea spilled out, almost overturning the table. Chapter 456. Well, I just heard a piece of news about Tang En. When he came back to his senses, he saw Bosco frowning and Enoch looking up in surprise. His body stiffened at once. He then loosened the collar of his military uniform and told them the news that he had heard from the soldier. His body also gradually relaxed. This was a good excuse, but it didn't match Borg's previous intense reaction. However, Bosco and Enoch both understood the inside story and could vaguely guess Borg's complicated thoughts, so they didn't say anything. Enoch took over the topic and tapped his finger on the wooden table. It's not surprising that Tang En has such strength, but Gray Space actually has such an agreement with Omeng? Well, could it be that he wants to intervene in the army? It shouldn't be Tang En's idea. Bosco shook his head and didn't explain much about this conclusion. However, since it could come out from the mouth of the experienced and astute Bosco, it was naturally an answer after a detailed investigation and analysis. It was proposed by his subordinate, Michaud, but it doesn't make much difference. The army's view of Tang'an. After a pause, he suddenly looked up and said to Borg, "Well, Borg, you know best about this point. Tell me more." Borg was stunned for a moment, and then he was delighted and straightened his body a little. Obviously, from now on, he was no longer the role that his father exhorted, but a real participant in the management of the family affairs. He didn't dare to neglect and pondered for a moment. Previously, the army's impression of Tang'an was both positive and negative. Well, it should be more negative because Tang'an stole a lot of the limelight that originally belonged to the army. However, after participating in the simulated war in gray space, this impression was completely reversed. Borg shook his head slightly. Although he was a little worried, he tried to be objective and said, "The army, in the end, is still a place where strength and achievements matter. Tang'an and gray space have strength, and they have shown the ability to match their achievements. Well, now most of the low-ranking officers and soldiers admire them a lot." Clap, clap. Enoch clapped his hands twice and said with a smile, "Well said." On the other side, Bosco's eyelids drooped and he didn't comment. Of course, Borg was already very happy and satisfied with this. In his opinion, as long as his father didn't scold him to his face, it at least meant that his words were qualified. Whether it is intentional or not, the gray space should not be underestimated. However, their actual influence in the army has not yet taken shape, so they are not a concern for the time being. After a while, Bosco gave his own judgment, and then he looked a little thoughtful. "But this Michaud, when I have time, I'll have to investigate him." "Well, let's not talk about this for the time being. Our current potential enemy is still Twain." Pausing for a moment, Bosco's expression became extremely serious. "Lassa's position is the highest, and her vigilance towards us is increasing day by day, but she is rational and knows how to make a choice. Tang'an, on the other hand, is completely different. He is someone who can change the situation with his own strength and even threaten our family's great cause. What's even more frightening is his unrestrained way of doing things. This kid can't be left alive. But now we can't afford to provoke him either." Bosco turned his head and said sternly, "Especially you, Borg. I know you have resentment in your heart, but now Tang'an is deeply trusted by Lhasa, and he is together with Zhuofan. And even if you put all these aside, you absolutely cannot provoke him. You have to understand that the family doesn't have a master who can fight against him. Also, you have to understand that a dead man can't do anything." Borg's heart trembled, and he quickly nodded solemnly, "Father, don't worry, I will remember it." Seeing that the atmosphere was a little heavy, Enoch smiled helplessly, and the previous bleak look appeared on his face again. "Elder brother is right. Well, don't have the idea of provoking Tang'an. I am a negative example. I planned the layout and destroyed a good chess piece with my own hand. In the end, I failed to kill him, and I even almost got myself into trouble. Haha, I really lifted a stone and smashed it on my own feet. Stupid. Really?" Bosco frowned and said. He waved his hand and said, "Elder brother, don't worry. I just borrowed someone else's knife to kill him. I did it very carefully and didn't leave any flaws." Then, Enoch explained in detail the plan to kill Tang'an in Mountain Stream City. Borg listened to this closely linked plan, and he couldn't help but admire it. Before, Second Uncle Bolai also schemed to kill Tang'an, but the plan was undoubtedly much cruder and simpler. After Tang'an returned, Second Uncle also paid a very painful price for it. In comparison, although Third Uncle's plan was not successful, he completely removed himself from the situation and did not suffer any backlash. "Well, it's still too risky." Bosco shook his head after listening. "I know. At that time, my intelligence rights were taken away. I had no choice, so I came up with this plan." Enoch nodded and then sighed. "Tang'an may have doubts about me, so we can't act rashly now. Well, since we can't be friends, we can't be enemies for the time being. It's best to treat him as a stranger. That's right. As for my side, it's a foregone conclusion that my rights were taken away, and it can't be restored for the time being. But as long as Tangan doesn't continue to be with Josiah, I have confidence that I can get my rights back. Clenching his fist, Enoch looked very confident. Then he raised his head slightly, as if he thought of something, and asked, I'm more concerned about the impact of this negotiation on our family. Elder brother, do you know Losha's attitude? Borg, who was standing at the side, was invigorated when he heard that. He hurriedly looked at Bosco. This was a matter of the family's fate, and now he was finally qualified to participate. Although he might not be able to express any opinions, it was still a big improvement. There will definitely be an impact. Bosco pinched the bridge of his nose, and a light flashed in his drooping eyes. For this negotiation, Losha can be said to be stubborn. Those bumpkin ministers who used to trust her also have opinions about her now. Haha, although these bumpkins are really ignorant, it's a great opportunity for our family to expand our influence in the Grey Coat Army. So no matter what the outcome of the negotiation is, it will only be good for us. If it fails, the benefits should be greater. Borg thought to himself, following Bosco's train of thought. This was a normal way of thinking. Losha's disregard for the negotiation had already made her supporters unhappy. If it fails, wouldn't it be even worse? But even so, Borg was still cautious and didn't say it out loud. The next moment, he realized that this decision was very wise. After a pause, Bosco crossed his hands in front of his chest. But this time, we have to stand on Losha's side and try to facilitate the negotiation as much as possible. Enoch raised his eyebrows and pinched his chin. Stand on Losha's side. Well, elder brother, you want the vote for the resolution of the Parliament? That's right. Bosco's cheeks were slightly red, and his voice was a little excited. This is a great opportunity for our family to regain its glory. The Parliament is the top floor of the Brand's power tower. Even some dukes and marquises may not be able to sit there. As long as we get a vote, we will have the identity of a member of Parliament. So what if we're not nobles? We can still have an illustrious position and enjoy the respect of others. These words were said quickly and quickly, like the drums on the battlefield, with a strange rhythm. Enoch and Borg's eyes were shining, and they were obviously a little excited. But, disbanding the army, this is not possible. Enoch's shrewdness was as deep as his gloomy face. After the excitement, he quickly recovered and asked a question. Yes, everyone knows it's not possible, including the nobles who came to negotiate and the second prince in the capital. Bosco's face returned to calmness, and his old eyes narrowed. But since they came, they naturally can't go back empty-handed. Wait, they will come up with a feasible proposal. When the time comes, as long as Losha agrees, our job is to persuade those ignorant bumpkins. Oh, our position in the Grey Coat Army is already important, and with this leverage, I don't believe that Losha won't give us a vote. Speaking of this, Bosco's mood was obviously better. Besides, if he doesn't give it to us, who else can he give it to? Those bumpkins? Haha, I really doubt if they can understand the complicated Parliament document. Haha, brother, you are right. Father, you are wise. Just like doing business, speculation was always faster than honest business. Of course, the premise was to have a unique vision, accurate judgment, and the ability to withstand the known and unknown risk. It had to be said that Bosco's vision was very good. Although leading the whole family to join the Grey Coat Army was a last resort, it was definitely not his only choice at that time. He made a judgment and then followed the Grey Coat Army to face dozens of sieges, big and small. During the period there were many disasters, but in the end they survived. Now, it turned out that his choice was correct, so naturally, he should enjoy the fruits of speculation. Not only that, What happened next once again proved that Bosco's prediction was correct. The noble negotiation team rested for a full day and a half in the Brand's barracks before they recovered. After that, it was unknown whether it was because they received orders, or because the front line was tense, or because they really didn't want to continue to stay in this barren wilderness. As soon as they recovered, they immediately started the second negotiation with the Greycoat army. This time, Tangan didn't go to the negotiation. He would rather drink with Fry and the others. He wasn't interested in provoking these old guys again. But in his opinion, this kind of deadlock negotiation shouldn't be easy to come to a conclusion. But this time, Tangan miscalculated. After Ronald and the others entered the Greycoat army's main tent in the morning, they didn't come out for a whole day. In the evening, when both sides walked out exhausted, the negotiation ended just like that, and it was a success. Chapter 457. On a certain day at the end of the 555 year of the Brand calendar, the old king of the Brand did not die, and the miracle of the god of light did not happen. The front line was on fire, and the northern wilderness did not break through the front line. It was a normal day. If there was something special about it, it was because the new year was approaching. The people of the other world were happy. After a year of hard work and a few months of preparation, they could finally have a slightly more comfortable new year. However, although this date was not known by the people of the continent and would not be known for a long time, it did not affect its status, because history would remember this day. The dark moon was dim, and a few stars were hanging low. Under the black curtain that covered the sky, a few long and strange sounds could be heard from the distant mountains that were faintly visible in the distance. It was like a lonely old wolf howling at the moon. It was also like the howling of the cold wind. Just when the sky and earth were dark, there were a few flickering flames in the mountains. There was no need to elaborate on the weather in the north. It was unusually cold. But behind this leeward hill, a group of people gathered around the bonfire without any shelter, laughing happily from time to time. It was not only the burning bonfire that brought them warmth, but more importantly, the pot of red soup on the bonfire was delicious. Well, it's about time to eat. Damn. Be more civilized, there's a lady here. Can you not be so loser? Can you? I'm talking to you, David. If you dare to fork 2 pieces of meat with a fork again, you can go away. Hiss, ah. There was a refreshing sound. Boss, it's not that I want to do this, but your knife skills are not good enough. Those 2 pieces of meat are connected together. My knife skills are not good enough? Come on, let's fight one-on-one. Leave some for me. Damn, if you fight again, I'll flip the pot. Hey, Leader Luo Sha, how are you? He ignored him. Haha, save it, boss. Your trick is useless. Before he finished, a rather majestic female voice sounded. Haha, everyone is here. Oh, hot pot? Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned around in surprise. There was no one around except for their companions who were fighting for meat. When he turned his head again, he did not know whether to laugh or cry. Tang you. Do you have to do this? That's right, boss is too wretched. Isn't it just a bit of meat? You're even using ventriloquism. Where's your integrity? Moral integrity? He had eaten it long ago. Yes. He replied straightforwardly, followed by a series of swallowing sounds. The lively quarrel and the vigorous looting continued until no more meat or vegetables came out of the red soup. Only then did the scene calm down. Tang En grabbed the last piece of vegetable and swallowed it with satisfaction. It tastes good. Mi Xiu cut the meat, David cut the vegetables. Let's get ready for the next round. It was only 1 pot, so naturally, it was not enough to fill everyone's stomach. The reason why he asked David and Mi Xiu to be his assistants was because, other than Tang En, there were also Joshua, Fry, and Titon. These people got along with Tang En as friends, so David and Fry had to suffer. Tang En looked around. Everyone was staring at the bonfire in a daze, or looking at the pieces of meat in Mi Xiu's hand. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were unfocused. Compared to the lively scene just now, the scene was a bit cold and cheerless. Tang En certainly knew the reason. He shook the wine jar in his hand at Fry, who was full of melancholy on the other side of the bonfire. Fry came back to his senses and raised the jar in his hand with a chuckle. "What's your plan?" This question came out of nowhere, but everyone present knew the meaning behind it. Fry wiped the wine stain on his mouth and pondered for a moment. His expression was complicated. "To be honest, I don't know. Well, how do I put it? I joined the army when I was a teenager. At that time, I was trying to make a living and not starve to death. After more than 10 years, I was lucky enough to climb out of the pile of corpses many times. At that time, I felt that I would stay on the battlefield for the rest of my life until I died. Or if I was unlucky and my leg was cut off, I would use my merits to exchange for compensation and find a farm to be a rich man who flirted with the maid. Don't laugh, this should not be a problem. At that time, the merits of the Thunder Spear Formation breaking team were enough for me to spend the rest of my life in luxury." After a pause, he shook his head. "Then I encountered that incident and went to prison. I was lucky to survive and entered the mine. At that time, I didn't think much of it. I just thought that I would die of old age here. I stayed here for more than 10 years. I haven't set foot on the front line for more than 10 years, and I haven't seen the barbarians in the northern wilderness. I didn't expect that I would be old. Brother Fry, actually you are not old. At most, you are middle-aged," Josiah suddenly said in a sweet voice. David narrowed his eyes and said, "Yes. And Brother Fry, the older you are, the more masculine you are. Hee, I heard that many beautiful widows in the City of Dawn are asking about you. There are also some young girls. Tsk. Oh, Fry could not take it any more. He hurriedly waved his hand and said, "Rumors, they are all rumors. Where was I? Oh, I didn't expect that I would return to the starting point when I am almost middle-aged. But since I have such a chance, I think I will go back. Even if it's just a visit to the place where my brothers died, I will feel much more at ease. My thoughts are the same as Brother Fry." Titon clinked his wine jug with phrase and took a sip. Then, he grinned and said, "But this time, I only hope to kill the barbarians again. Haha, although I can bear to fight against the brand soldiers, I still feel uncomfortable. Chopping off the heads of the barbarians is more satisfying." Tangan raised his wine jug and said, "These words make me feel better. Come, cheers." Cheers. Everyone shouted in agreement. They raised their jugs and gulped down the wine. Tangan exhaled and turned to look at Josiah, who was blushing. He asked, "So, the result of this negotiation is that the Grey Coat Army will send troops to the front line?" Josiah nodded and said, "There are some other things, but this is the most important. The first batch will be at least 30,000 soldiers." "Oh, they won't lose out. Only they can think of this." Tang Yen laughed non-committally. He threw away the empty wine jug and watched it roll down the hill. It must have hit something along the way and shattered with a bang. That's right, this was the agreement between the aristocrats and Lhasa. The Grey Coat Army received a series of conditions and the 3 votes from the parliament. In return, they had to send 30,000 soldiers to the front line to fight against the northern wilderness tribes with the regular soldiers. It had to be said that this was indeed a very compromised proposal. It was impossible for the Grey Coat Army to disband. Everyone knew this. However, if they were sent to the battlefield, it would be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The aristocrats would not have to worry about the unstable explosive crystals behind them. They could also increase the combat power of the front line. It was a good plan. As for the Grey Coat Army, even if they were sent to the battlefield, their ownership would not change. They would still be part of the Grey Coat Army. Moreover, since they had accepted so many benefits from the brand, they had to give something in return. Moreover, they had to deal with the barbarians who abused the civilians. There was no reason to reject this. They hit it off. Tang, what are your plans? Fry asked casually as he picked up the wine jug and removed the seal. Me? Tang raised his eyebrows and narrowed his eyes. Go, of course I'm going. Fry was a little surprised by his straightforwardness. Why are you going? Sipping the wine and smacking his lips, Tang answered casually, There's someone I don't like on the front line. I'm going to kill him and come back. Oh, the hot pot is almost ready. And let me try it. Looking at the boiling red soup, Tang quickly stabbed a piece of meat with his fork and put it in his mouth. He chewed a few times and handed over the fork again. It's not ready yet. Let me try it again. It's not enough. Let me try again. Looking at the fork after fork, Fry opened his mouth but shook his head in the end. He was speechless. Boss is cheating. Everyone, let's go. Following David's shout, a new round of food snatching started again. Josiah didn't start eating. She was still thinking about Tang's words. She turned her head and looked at Tang, who was concentrating on snatching the food. She pursed her lips thoughtfully. Previously, when Tang gave her funding for the secret organization, he asked her to help investigate the movements of a group of Temple of Light teams. In the end, that group of people went to the front line. Coupled with Tang's previous statement that he had an enemy who was from the Temple of Light, everything came to light. After thinking it through, Josiah looked a little worried. For a long time, she had believed in Tang's strength and even worshipped him blindly. Previously, when the secret organization was in trouble, the first thing she thought of was Tang. When she saw him in front of her, her heart suddenly calmed down. But the Temple of Light, such a behemoth would become an enemy. Just thinking about it made her feel powerless. What about Yema? It was amazing to be able to touch the threshold of void level, but in the end, he was still chased around like a dog. Tang didn't see the change in Josiah's expression. Seeing that she didn't eat with her fork, he asked curiously, losing weight? No. I'm full just now. Oh. Without suspecting anything, Tang turned his head and stared at the hot pot again. From time to time, he quickly reached out with his fork. Soon, the red soup was still boiling, but the pot of meat and vegetables had been wiped clean. Only Titan was still using his fork to poke at it, looking unwilling to give up. It could be said that Titan was the one who suffered the most in these two fights. Snatching things was about having sharp eyes and quick hands. Just this point alone made him unable to compete with Tang and Michaud. As for Fry and David, although they were also strength type, they were much stronger than him. As for Josiah, she had to be excluded. There were people who wanted to snatch Titan's food, but would anyone want to snatch Josiah's food? If I knew this would happen, I wouldn't have stayed with you guys. It's too much of a loss. Just as Titan was about to give up and pick up his fork, he was shocked to find that the tip of his fork had pierced through a piece of undamaged meat. It should have been stuck to the bottom of the pot before, and after being poked by the fork, it was naturally scooped up. Regardless, Titan was overjoyed. He picked up his fork and was about to put it into his mouth. But before the piece of meat could completely leave the soup, Titan saw a black shadow flash in front of him, and then he found that the piece of meat had disappeared from his fork. Immediately, the two tridents arrived at the same time and collided with each other with a ding. F***ck. Michaud. Michaud's face was calm and the corner of his mouth was slightly raised. It was as if the person who had just attacked wasn't him. It had to be said that Michaud's hand speed was terrifying. It was easy for him to snatch something from Titan's hand. However, Michaud's calm expression didn't last long. In the blink of an eye, another fork intercepted his attack. Michaud's face changed. He didn't need to look up to know that it was Tang. Only he could match his hand speed. Haha, young man, in an instant, the surface of the pot was filled with illusions. Michaud shook his wrist as if he was facing a great enemy, and all kinds of irregular arcs were drawn in an attempt to avoid the fork that followed him like a shadow. You know, David, Fry, and Titon were dumbfounded when they saw the illusions in front of them. They couldn't tell if the illusions were real or fake. They really couldn't get involved in this kind of small-scale teleportation. He'll have the last laugh, ding. With a slight sound, the illusions disappeared, and the piece of meat in Michaud's fork disappeared. Tang Yin's fork accurately pierced the piece of meat just as it fell into the soup. That's what I call a smile. Tang Yin blinked his eyes and looked at the empty fork in front of him. Then, he looked at the white gleam on the surface of the pot, and the piece of meat was embedded in the middle like an amber. He roared in despair. Joe. Yeah. You can't do this. The bottom of the pot is frozen by you. How are we going to eat hot pot? Chapter 458. With the agreement reached, the long-lasting standoff finally came to an end. The next day, more than 100,000 regular soldiers quickly withdrew from the 100,000 mountains. It was important to note that these troops were not retreating to the rear. Instead, they were retreating to the front line in the north. Obviously, without the support of the reserve troops at the rear, the battle there had become even more tense. The Grey Coat Army set off half a day later, but they were heading to the City of Dawn. Although they had reached an agreement, they were not in a hurry. They could wait until the new year in 3 days. Then, the first batch of 30,000 soldiers would officially set off to the front line. Hurriedly, the 80,000 Grey Coat Army finally returned to the City of Dawn on the evening before the new year. Rosa did not delay. He immediately posted the results of the negotiation to the entire city. There was no need to elaborate on the complicated conditions. However, the last few paragraphs expressed the thoughts of most of the Grey Coat Army citizens. The first sentence of the second chapter of the Divine Light Doctrine is that everyone is a citizen of God. My understanding of this sentence is that since everyone is a citizen of God, just like how we have 3 or 4 children, their status must be equal. The number of candies they receive should also be fair. Unfortunately, what we saw, heard, and felt before was not so. Therefore, we chose to stand up and gather together to fight for the past few decades. During this period, we have faced more than one desperate situation. We have also lost our family, friends, and like-minded companions. However, we know and firmly believe that freedom, fairness, and justice will eventually come. The waiting time is always long. However, what will come will never be stopped. Just like the rising sun, the first ray of light will always pierce through the darkness. We are proud that we are the first ray of light. Fortunately, we did not let those who were waiting for us wait for too long. Now, from this moment onwards, our names will no longer appear in front of the world as rebels and bandits. We will no longer see swords, spears, and axes. We will no longer be homeless and homeless. Therefore, please proudly raise your noble heads, raise your hands and cheer. We have won. We have won. We have won. We have won. That night, the City of Dawn became a city that never slept. Crowds of people gathered in front of the gate. Although their faces were different, their ecstatic expressions were the same. Waves of cheers resounded throughout the city, shaking the mountains and echoing in the universe. It should be said that Rosa's previous judgment was correct. Civilians were different from soldiers. When soldiers picked up their weapons, other than protecting their homes, they should also have the ambition to kill the enemy and gain merit. What the people wanted was a relatively fair and peaceful life. That's right, everyone knew that this kind of life required iron and blood, but they had seen too much slaughter, too much blood, too much. The next morning, on the first day of the new year, the newspapers in Bran published similar content. However, the tone was naturally different. Bran suddenly took the lead and said that after an arduous negotiation, the Grey Coat Army finally retreated. Then, under the premise of alleviating the suffering of the people, the two sides reached the following agreement after friendly negotiations. It sounded like an adult coaxing a child, but no one would believe it, and no one would care about it at the moment. The citizens only cared about the vague conditions. Reducing unnecessary taxes? The children of the commoners could enter the academy. In a short period of time, the enthusiastic celebration in the City of Dawn was replicated in various cities. The only difference was that the slogan changed from, "We have won," to "Long live the Grey Coat Army," and so on. The officials from the publicity department, who had worked hard to choose their words to highlight the achievements of the brand, were furious. Of course, the cheers here could not reach the 100,000 mountains, because of the celebration last night. The morning in the City of Dawn was unusually quiet. There were some remnants of the celebration on the flat streets, but no one was in sight. Thud! A wooden bottle flew out from the corner of the street. Then 2 figures, one big and one small, appeared in the thin morning fog. They were holding hands and walking casually. After a few steps, the bottle was kicked by the short figure again, and it continued to be kicked all the way. They were Twain and Little Carol. Last night, as soon as the army returned to the city, Little Carol found Twain, but they were immediately pulled into the celebratory procession. They had just come out of the barracks. Fortunately, Little Carol was by his side. Otherwise, Tangen would have been drunk by the soldiers, just like David and the rest. Phew! He took a deep breath of the cool morning air and exhaled slowly. Tangen's mind instantly cleared. He shook his head, and the drowsiness subsided. Then, he looked at the unhappy Little Carol, and could not help but smile bitterly. Tangen would go to the front line in 2 days. This time, he was determined to kill Sessman. Naturally, he could not bring Little Carol along. Furthermore, Little Carol was very dependent on him. They had just met, but they had to separate. Of course, Little Carol was unhappy. Stepping on the wooden bottle, Tang-en rubbed his nose. "Well, Little Carol, Brother Tang-en promises you that he will be back soon. Is that okay?" "No," she replied in a muffled voice. Little Carol pursed her lips and looked up. "I want to go with you." Well, she did not even call him brother. Shaking his head, Tang-en firmly refused without thinking. "No, that is a place where people are killed. You can't go. I have the strength. No matter how strong you are, you can't go." She anxiously refused. Then, seeing Little Carol's stubborn appearance, Tang-en's tone softened. "I know you are very strong now. But if you want to survive there, the most important thing is not strength. Well, it's not an exaggeration to say that I don't have absolute confidence that I can escape unscathed this time. If you go with me again, I will be distracted. Do you understand?" Little Carol lowered her head in silence. She seemed to understand, but also seemed to not hear. She kicked the wooden bottle again and walked forward. "What a headache!" Tang-en pinched his chin. He knew Little Carol's personality very well. Once she was stubborn, no one could persuade her. It seemed that he had to leave a few people behind to keep an eye on her. "Please stay." "Well, no matter what, this order was given by me. No matter how much you apologize, it won't save your son's life." "Well, I know you don't blame me. He deserves the title of a martyr. In short, I will come to see you often. If you think I'm not suitable, you can have someone else come over. I won't let you be lonely." Tang-en raised his eyebrows and looked at the door of a house. A person who should not have appeared here was bowing to an old lady and retreating. He looked a little humble. "Remember to remind me to come over in the future. If the old lady lacks anything, you can send it over directly. Tang-en? Little Carol. Hee Happy New Year." Just as he was explaining something to the people around him, he looked up and saw Tang-en and Little Carol. After a moment of surprise, he greeted them with a smile. "Happy New Year, leader." Tang-en brought Little Carol forward to greet him and said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Then where should I be now?" Tang-en shrugged his shoulders and said, "At the gathering with the ministers. Or you can rest after the celebration. I just came back from there. Do you remember? After saying a few more words to his subordinates, Rosa turned his head and touched little Carol's hair. He spread his arms and said, "You smell of alcohol. Well, you just came back from the military camp. Hee, if you don't have anything else, how about taking a walk with me?" Of course, no problem. Leader, please." The interior of the City of Dawn was gradually being completed. Other than the gorgeous decorations, the layout was not much different from the cities near the front line in Bran. The biggest difference was that there were no passing merchants or anything like that. However, this was only temporary. After the agreement was reached, the city would be opened to the outside world. With Tangen's rank, he naturally had a house in the city. In terms of direction, it was somewhat similar to Rosa's house. "Tang, I heard from Josiah that you are going to the front line this time?" Although it was Rosa who suggested taking a walk, they did not talk about any formal topics after walking down the street. Finally, after teasing little Carol for a while, Rosa turned his head and asked. Tangen nodded and said, "Yes, there are some things I need to settle. By the way, leader, is the first batch of 30,000 people designated?" "The officers will designate it, but the soldiers will not. Now, it is voluntary to go. If there are not enough people, then it will be decided by the combat department." Rosa shook his head and explained. Then, he looked at Tangen and said, "Actually, I don't want you to go. Well, it's not that I don't believe in your ability. It's just that you are too important to the Grey Coat Army now." Is this a compliment in disguise? Thank you. Ha! Rosa shook his head and laughed. When he saw that Tang En did not respond to his words, he knew that he had made up his mind. He did not say anything more and changed the topic. "Well, I wanted to discuss it with you before, but unfortunately, you were not there at that time. Tang, what do you think of this negotiation?" Here it comes. When Rosa suggested taking a walk, Tang En had already expected this question. He touched his nose and said, "Leader, you think too highly of me. This is a question that can only be answered with time and result." "You don't know either? Well, or you don't think highly of it." Rosa looked a little disappointed. "Please, I am just a transmigrator, not a reincarnator." After complaining, Tang En shook his head and said, "It's not that I think highly of it or not. Well, there is a saying in my hometown, man proposes, God disposes. Since the leader has done everything he can, then the rest is up to God to decide. Man proposes, God disposes. That makes sense." Rosa nodded thoughtfully. "Well, what if the result is bad?" Tang En casually replied, "Then curse God. At least we have found a scapegoat, right?" Tang Yu. The attitude of the people of the Bran Empire towards the God of Light was needless to say. Even if they did not believe in it, they would absolutely not dare to criticize it. So even though Rosa felt that it was quite a bold thing to rebel against the Bran, now he was shocked by Tangen's attitude of cursing God. After calming down, Rosa could not help but shake his head and said, "Tang, if it were not for the fact that your body shape is really different, I would really think that you are a barbarian from the northern wilderness. In the future, it's better not to say such things. It will cause a lot of trouble." "Trouble? Now, I want to find trouble with them." Tang En curled his lips and disapproved. But naturally, he would not say anything to Rosa. Rosa looked up and said, "In fact, you are right. Well, maybe I am too greedy or I am not confident enough. Since I have made a decision, I want a perfect result immediately." Tangen shook his head slightly and said, "No, it's just that the leader is under too much pressure. Well, let's put it another way. If you let the leader choose again, would you negotiate?" "Of course," Rosa quickly affirmed, then smiled and nodded. "Oh yes, that's right. Well, just like just now, you also saw. The old woman's 3 sons have all joined the army. 2 of them died in battle, and the last one became a regiment commander. During the confrontation before, he secretly led the troops out of the camp to eliminate 3 brigades of Bran soldiers. As a result, I ordered him to be beheaded. At that time I did not regret it, but when I saw the old woman just now, I suddenly regretted it. I regretted that the order was too heavy and too cruel. 3 sons, all gone. He paused and lowered his head, full of sadness. Then he pursed his lips and took a deep breath. But if I were to go back to that time, I believe that I would still give the same order. Tang En nodded silently, indicating that he understood. Chapter 459. On the 3rd day after the New Year, the Grey Coat Army gathered their troops and officially set off. Other than the high-ranking officers who were appointed by the combat department, the 30,000 soldiers signed up voluntarily. As mentioned before, the desire of civilians was to live a peaceful life, but most soldiers had other ambitions besides that. For this expedition, the Grey Coat Army was under the command of the Bran. If the soldiers could kill the enemy and make contributions, not only would they receive rewards from the Grey Coat Army, but they would also receive military honors from the Bran. With these 2 incentives, the young soldiers were naturally fired up for the battle. Although they signed up voluntarily, Omen had to deploy them. Hence, the 30,000 soldiers were divided equally among the 5 legions of the Grey Coat Army. The Bran was not worried that the Grey Coat Army would play any tricks, such as sending the old and weak soldiers. The Grey Coat Army was not one of the 4 great lords. They were going to the front line where the casualty rate was high. Given the nature of the Grey Coat Army, Rosa and the rest would not sit back and watch their soldiers die. It was even more impossible for the old and weak soldiers to do so. As for Tang En, other than leaving a few people behind to watch over little Carol, he brought along the entire Grey Space team. Just like what he had said to the old butler a few days ago, he was going all out. He had to kill Sessman. The 100,000 mountains was vast. No one had even reached the end of it in the west. The front line was located in the north. However, after the army set off from the City of Dawn, they did not go through the 100,000 mountains directly to the north. Although they could reduce the distance, the unknown danger would also increase greatly. After all, no one could guarantee that a powerful magical beast would not suddenly appear in this desolate place. It was very likely that the entire army would be wiped out on the winding mountain road. The densely packed soldiers continued to advance. Brother Tang En, what's wrong? You look absent-minded. Fry turned his head and asked in surprise. He was also looking around and saw that the soldiers were discussing among themselves. Oh, it's nothing. Tang En retracted his gaze and replied casually. To be honest, although he had left a few people behind, he was still a little worried that little Carol would follow. It was fine if they found out now, but if they found out a few days later, they wouldn't even be able to send them back. By the way, Brother Fry, although he had often heard people mention them, what was the situation with the barbarians in the northern wilderness? You're most familiar with this. Tell me more about it. Although their target on this trip to the front line was Sessman, Tang En was not naive enough to think that they would encounter him so easily. Therefore, the first thing he had to consider was how to survive on the battlefield with the Grey Space team. The first thing he had to do was naturally to learn as much as possible about the enemy. David and the others were also very interested in this topic, and quickly came over. Barbarians. Fry stroked his short green beard, looking as if he was recalling something. In fact, barbarians are similar to us in appearance. They have 2 shoulders and a head. But their physique is stronger, their hair is thicker, and they have a very strong smell. Haha, this gives them a lot of trouble in hiding and ambushing. I think they haven't fully evolved and their hair hasn't been completely shed. And that smell, damn, it's very fishy, it makes people want to vomit, but now I kind of miss it. Titan laughed and walked over from the crowd. He had a fiery temper and his evaluation of the barbarians was even more direct and rude. Because it was voluntary this time, the organization was a little messy and complicated. Fry and Titon were both battalion commanders, but only half of their soldiers came. Tangan brought the gray space team directly to Frey's side, while Titon was a little arrogant and pulled some soldiers to form a new battalion. Haha, that's true. Fry also laughed and nodded in agreement. It's a little uncomfortable at first, but it's gradually getting better. In fact, when the real battle starts, you can't smell anything other than the smell of blood. Tangan and the others weren't novices on the battlefield, so they agreed with Frey's words. But jokes are jokes. Frey's face turned serious and he said seriously, "The barbarians' fighting strength is still very strong. Their physiques are naturally strong, even stronger than the brand northern barbarians by a few times. And when they fight, they are extremely bloodthirsty and crazy. I'm not sure how they are now, but when I was in the army 10 years ago, it would take 3 brand regular soldiers to block the attack of a normal barbarian." Wow, they're that strong? David and the others couldn't help but click their tongues when they heard this. Those were the soldiers of the brand's 3 major legions, not the second-rate soldiers of the military. That's right. Titon's face was also a little serious. He licked his lips and nodded fiercely, saying, "And they're just normal barbarians." Normal? Tangan raised his eyebrows. Then what about those who aren't normal? We'll have to talk about the system in the northern wilderness. The northern wilderness tribes are actually made up of thousands of tribes of various sizes. Let's not talk about the smaller tribes. Although some barbarians are quite troublesome, they're not many in number. Let's focus on the elite barbarian soldiers of a few large tribes. He paused for a moment. If you see a battle formation made up of golden-furred, blood-red-eyed barbarians on the battlefield in the future, and you're not 5 times stronger than them, it's best to avoid them. That's because they're the elite barbarian soldiers of the Battle Lion tribe, bloodthirsty lions. Almost all of them are born with superhuman strength, and their fighting strength is astonishing. The Ashen Flame Legion had a battle record in the past. A 3,000 infantry division accidentally met 500 bloodthirsty lions in the wilderness. That division commander was in a hurry to reinforce his allies, so he sent out an unreasonable number of scouts. In the end, they met on a narrow path and had no way out. In the end, although we don't know how many casualties they suffered, when the Ashen Flame Legion sent people to search for them, they found that the entire division had been annihilated, with no survivors. Titon nodded. I've heard about this too. It seems that a deputy general was defeated because of this and had to stand guard at the armory with a spear. Fry continued, "There are also 2 types of barbarian soldiers that are more troublesome to deal with. One is the aerial soldiers of the northern wilderness, called the Falcon Air Cavalry. They're the elite barbarian soldiers of the Wild Eagle tribe. Their main purpose is to train a large eagle as a mount. It can carry people over short distances, ignoring obstacles like city walls and diving attacks. The other is the Serpentis Guard of the Hidden Snake tribe. The barbarians of this tribe are generally skinny and weak, but because of this, they're best at gathering intelligence and assassinating. Over the years, many Bran officers died under their scimitars." David smacked his lips. TSK, that Serpentis Guard sounds a bit like our gray space. Falcon Air Cavalry, Serpentis Guard. Tangan nodded thoughtfully. Thanks to Sessman, he had seen these 2 types of soldiers in the northern wilderness. Finally, Fry suddenly raised his index finger, his face unprecedentedly serious. And I'm just saying if, these barbarian soldiers are rare. If you see a group of barbarian cavalry riding giant green-armored wolves, holding long spears and carrying dozens of short spears on their backs, it's best to immediately hide. If you can't hide in time, then set up a defensive formation with shields. Remember, don't turn around and run, because they'll definitely attack. If you defend, you might have a chance to survive. Maybe they're just passing by and don't have any intention of attacking. Tangan, David, and the others were a bit stunned. Frey's courage didn't need to be mentioned. Just based on his Thunder Spear formation breaking team's record of being the first to attack the enemy's camp in every battle, they knew that he was definitely someone who would risk his life in battle. But now, from what he said, it seemed that he didn't even have any intention of attacking. This shocked them greatly. Ahem! On the side, Titon cleared his throat twice, his face a bit unsightly. Fry is right. That's the Wilderness Wolf Cavalry, the elite troop of the Heavenly Wolf Tribe. The Heavenly Wolf Tribe is the royal family of the Northern Wilderness, and a large part of the reason why they can suppress the other tribes is because of these invincible Wilderness Wolf Cavalry. The Wilderness Wolf Cavalry, invincible? Could it be that they've never been defeated? David asked in surprise. Haha, of course that's impossible. Frey's relaxed expression returned, and he chuckled. As far as I know, these Wilderness Wolf Cavalry appeared many years ago. But at that time, although they were powerful, they didn't have the reputation of being invincible. Naturally, it was inevitable that they would suffer losses. But about 20 or 30 years ago, these Wilderness Wolf Cavalry suddenly rose up. They defeated every enemy they met, and they won every battle. Very quickly, they made a name for themselves. Except for losing to Army God Z 20 years ago, they have never been defeated. Defeated once every few decades. That's amazing? Haha, that's how amazing they are. Fred shook his head and laughed. Actually, there are some rumors saying that the reason why the Wilderness Wolf Riders are so powerful is because they have a new leader. I think he's called Danica or something. Well, it's just hearsay. There's no proof. There's also another saying that the reason why the Wilderness Wolf Cavalry rarely loses is because they only fight in the open. They don't participate in the siege of the city walls. Haha, of course, this is a bit of nonsense. After all, cavalry isn't suitable for sieges. Michaud, who had been quiet on the side, suddenly spoke up. Brother Fry, you seem to know a lot about the Wilderness Wolf Cavalry? Oh? Have I been discovered? Fry shrugged and laughed self-deprecatingly. Haha, that's right. I've been defeated by the Wilderness Wolf Cavalry before. Well, I feel like I'm flattering myself by saying this. At that time, I was just a small soldier in the Spear Brigade. One evening, the brigade received news that a few dozen barbarians had broken through the border and entered our patrol area. This situation is very normal at the front line, and it happens almost every day. Those barbarians come in to steal food, and if we meet them, we fight. If the barbarians have the advantage in numbers, we hide and wait for them to leave. That day, the news said that there were only a few dozen barbarians, so our brigade of more than 100 people went out to patrol. In the end, we met the barbarians outside a farm. Well, the number is correct, about 20 barbarians, but they were all riding wolves. Before we could get close, we were discovered by the beasts. The next thing I heard was a wolf's howl, and my companions were continuously thrown short spears that pierced through their bodies. We couldn't charge forward, and we couldn't escape either. The barbarians easily caught up with us. At that time, I was stabbed in the left side of my lower abdomen by a short spear, and then fainted. Of course, I was saved in time, and luckily, I didn't die. But I was the only one in the brigade that was so lucky. Chapter 460. A troop of 30,000 people was not small. As they walked along the winding mountain road, they looked like a long chain from afar. Perhaps it was because they had not yet left the 100,000 mountains. The soldiers were chatting in low voices. Most of the topics were about the front line, glory, barbarians, and so on. When they gathered together, it was a low buzzing sound. Such behavior naturally damaged the military's prestige, but the officers seemed to have received orders. No one came out to stop them. Just like what Fry was saying, he was not the only one who had been to the front line. Therefore, it did not take long for the news about the ferocity of the barbarians to spread among the troops. And this was the intention of the senior officers in the army. Although the Grey Coat Army had been fighting for many years, and some of the veterans had even been in the army for more than 10 years, they had only fought against the Brand soldiers. They had no experience fighting against the barbarians of the northern wilderness. The barbarians of the Brand were naturally different from the second-rate Brand soldiers. Therefore, it was necessary to let the soldiers know the true nature of the barbarians. Of course, it was inevitable that word of mouth would be biased. The senior officers in the army naturally had a response to this. There was still a long way to the front line, so they had time to organize the information about the barbarians and slowly pass it to the soldiers. As for now, it was just laying the groundwork. Brother Fry, according to what you said, we have no chance of winning at the front line this time? David scratched his head with a gloomy face. After Fry told them about the terror of the barbarians of the northern wilderness and the other elite soldiers, Tang En and the others were shocked. To be honest, although they had never looked down on the barbarians of the northern wilderness and knew that the neighbors of the Brand were not good people, it was also a fact that the northern wilderness had not broken through the Brand's front line after so many years. This inevitably made people think that the barbarians of the northern wilderness were not that different from the Brand soldiers. But now, Fry told them that the barbarians were not that simple. Of course not. Fry shook his head and waved his hand to explain. The barbarians have their advantages. We naturally have our strength. Barbarians had strong physiques and developed limbs, which gave them an absolute advantage in close combat. But we have nimble hands and intelligent brains, so we have alchemy, Mjolnir, large-scale siege crossbows, and so on. He paused for a moment before continuing. An ordinary barbarian can defeat 3 regular Brand soldiers, and a single attack from Mjolnir can destroy nearly 100 barbarians. As long as we are good at using military equipment, the barbarians aren't that scary. Oh! David heaved a sigh of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't think that he couldn't defeat the barbarians, but it was undoubtedly better to have an easy way to deal with them. However, Tang En didn't relax so quickly. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Brother Fry, you were talking about defending the city, right? What if we bump into each other in the wilderness? In the wild, unless you have Mjolnir of Mjolnir with you, it will only be a bitter battle." Fry shook his head and said, "When I was in the army, the Blank's army actually won against the barbarians very few times in the wilderness. 1 or 2 barbarians might not be a big deal, but when thousands of barbarians gather in a square formation and charge together on the plains, the momentum, well, it's really like the sky and earth are collapsing. People who haven't experienced it personally will never understand the horror. In fact, the Brand and the northern wilderness have been fighting for so many years, but the final result is that the barbarians retreated on their own after they realized that they couldn't get anything from the Brand. That's just a lie to fool the people. What's even more depressing is that when the barbarians retreat, you can't chase after them, or rather, you don't dare to chase after them. Most of the terrain outside the border is flat grassland. If you fight with the barbarians there, you will undoubtedly be at a great disadvantage. Well, there's another saying here. Marshal Z is known as the god of war among the people, but very few people in the army call him that because they think that Z hasn't really attacked the northern wilderness, so he doesn't deserve this title. TSK, even Marshal Z is afraid of this, so no one dares to go out and seek death. Tang En grimaced when he heard this because he thought of a possibility. He then asked Fry, "We can be counted as new recruits. We don't have any experience in fighting against the barbarians. We should be sent to defend the city, right?" Sigh, unfortunately, I don't think that's possible. Fry glanced at Tang En and said bitterly, "To be honest, this is also a problem that I'm worried about. I've also received some information about the front line. It's very chaotic there. Other than the Zechen Legion's defense area, the Thunder and Blue Flame Legion's front line only exists in name. Now, they have probably retreated to the second and third lines to defend the front line. In other words, the front line is now a lawless area of a few hundred kilometers. Fry turned his head and looked at the soldiers around him. We have 30,000 people going to the front line this time. Among them, the rations will be provided by the Bran, and the equipment will also be provided by the Bran. After taking so many things, will they let us go so easily? It's very likely that we will be thrown into this lawless area of a few hundred kilometers to face the barbarians in the wilderness. Well, in other words, we will most likely be used as cannon fodder. F***ck. The conflict between the Greycoat Army and the Blank's army had been going on for a long time. Over the years, many people from both sides had died. This was not a problem that could be solved with a paper agreement. Now that the Greycoat Army was under the Bran's army in name, it was almost certain that they would be punished. But Brother Tang-en, you don't have to worry too much. Fry comforted him. After all, we are here to support our allies. They won't dare to do too much. Also, we have a special liaison officer here to mediate between the two sides. Well, this should be able to contain some problems. The reason was right and the words were right. However, the two words, should, that were not very confident showed that Fry was not optimistic about the future. How dare they? If they dare to mess with me, I will beat them to death. David waved his fist, and there was a slight sound of wind breaking. Unlike Fry, David had been with the Greycoat Army for many years. Naturally, he did not have a good impression of the Bran's army. Count me in. It's fine if they don't mess with us, but if they dare to play dirty, I don't mind sneaking over in the middle of the night and taking away their dog head. Fry and Titon looked at each other and couldn't help but smile bitterly when they saw David and the others suddenly become agitated. This was a very tricky situation. They could only hope that it would not happen when the time came. The journey for the next few days was still hurried. However, the officers were called for a meeting. Tang-en also went. The person who presided over the meeting was not old Marshal O-Meng. He was now in charge of the rear. This time, it was Daniel, who was the original commander of the First Army, who came over. The military meeting was quite military-like. It was simple and direct. There were two main things. First, everyone was given a stack of information about the barbarians in the northern wilderness. They were to bring it back to their subordinates and explain it. As for the second thing, it was a mandatory rule. All the soldiers of the Greycoat Army were not to have any conflicts with the Brand soldiers. If there were any conflicts or provocations, they were to communicate directly with the liaison officer. From the rules that were specifically listed, Daniel and the others knew that this was a hidden danger and a tricky situation. Everyone knew that no matter where the soldiers were, there would never be a shortage of hot-tempered soldiers. Hence, although there were punishment measures, it was hard to say what the outcome would be on the fifth night after the 30,000 soldiers left the City of Dawn. On the outer wall of the East City Gate, a short figure carrying a large bag grabbed a long rope and slid down quickly. It had to be said that she had chosen the right time. Just as she landed on the ground, the patrolling soldiers on the city wall, who had just changed their shifts, slowly walked past. Brother Tang-en, I'm going to look for you. Oh, I can't do that for now. Brother Josiah said that only Sister Tang-en knows the whereabouts of Brother Tang-en. Yes, I'll look for Sister Josiah first. Mountain Creek City, East. As she muttered softly, the short figure left the perimeter of the city wall. After about half an hour, she felt her way to a leeward hill. Then, a horse neighed, and she rode alone to the east. Captain Harry, the target has escaped. A voice suddenly sounded from the top of the hill. Escaped? Who escaped? A slightly plump figure was the first to stand up. He opened his mouth and yawned, looking rather lazy. However, when he saw the blurry figure of the short cavalryman in the distance, his body suddenly trembled. Aha, she finally escaped. She is indeed Boss's sister. Her patience is very strong. Yes, it's just that her common sense is lacking. She hid the horse here and even asked me to feed it for a few days. TSK, it's indeed this route. I really have to thank Fei Rue. Boss Harry, you know her target? As long as she doesn't go to the front line. Yes, it's good to go out and relax. Let's go. Our mission this time is to accompany the princess to have fun. Yes. Chapter 461. The brand's national announcement on the first day of the new year made the citizens ecstatic. After they looked away from the tempting conditions, most of them had an unbelievable thought. The brand nobles seemed to have compromised with the Grey Coat Army. In fact, from the newspaper's title of Grey Coat Army to the current Grey Coat Army, as well as the conditions that were obviously derived from the Grey Coat Army's mission, this thought should be confirmed without a doubt. However, the citizens still couldn't quite believe it. Originally, the nobles of the brand hated the Grey Coat Army to the core. Over the past few decades, they had besieged and suppressed the Grey Coat Army nearly 100 times. But now they had inexplicably compromised. It sounded more like a fairy tale, however. This doubt was quickly solved because a troop of 30,000 people officially appeared in their sight. They didn't have any standard armor, fine weapons, or the insignia of the army they belonged to. It was obvious that they weren't the regular brand soldiers. Their armors were a little strange. Take one soldier for example. He wore a steel helmet on his head, a brass breastplate on his upper body, and a large leaf chain armor knee pad on his lower body. It was scattered all over his body. Almost as many pieces of armor as there were parts of the armor, there were parts of different armors on him. And this was definitely not an exception. Almost everyone was the same. There were even more strange ones. The various armor parts on their bodies were printed with the insignia of the various brand armies. It was really funny. And even without the armor, these people's weapons were a little funny. As everyone knew, the army was basically organized according to the weapons. Of course, this was not for the sake of looking neat, but for tactical needs. For example, the greatsword squad was good at attacking, the spear squad was good at blocking cavalry, and so on. It could be seen that the army in front of them was organized in this way, but the weapons inside were not standardized. For example, in a squad that looked like a greatsword, in addition to most of them holding two-handed greatswords, there were also some who held one-handed greatswords, some who held knight swords, and some who held sword-like weapons. It could be said that if it wasn't for the strict military discipline of this army and the solemn atmosphere of the silent march, it could be said that this army was synonymous with a motley crew. However, no matter how funny the army looked, none of the citizens actually laughed. Because not long after, everyone remembered where they came from. They were the Grey Coat Army. Thinking about this, looking at the various armors and weapons, as well as the emaciated young soldiers, everyone had a different feeling. Such soldiers and such equipment were actually able to resist the brand for dozens of years, and even turn the tables in one fell swoop. What an incredible battle record and spirit! After asking around, they learned that this army was heading to the front lines to fight against the barbarians in the northern wilderness. Everyone was excited. The Grey Coat Army traveled north. Almost every city they passed by was filled with cheers and applause from the citizens. This kind of treatment caused the eyes of many gray-clothed soldiers to turn red and tear up. After so many years, they could finally walk in the brand city with their heads held high and enjoy the glory that they deserved. To the soldiers of the Grey Coat Army, this was definitely not as simple as a moment of emotion. When Rosa first decided to negotiate, it could be said that the biggest resistance and pressure did not come from the ministers, but from the soldiers in the army. This was also obvious. They had been fighting against the brand for dozens of years, and their eyes were already red from the killing. Therefore, even though O Meng and the other high-ranking military officers were suppressing them, they could only silently suppress their dissatisfaction. However, this kind of accumulated emotion was also the most worrisome. This was because all that was needed was a fuse, and this kind of suppressed emotion would explode exponentially, and it could very well cause a devastating effect. But now, when these soldiers heard the cheers of the citizens, they could not suppress the pride in their hearts. The pride in their hearts quickly rose, and it even surpassed the hatred they had for the brand soldiers. Of course, this did not mean that they no longer hated the brand soldiers. It was just that they had begun to realize that their previous battles were not just for the sake of killing, but for a more noble purpose, similar to the meaning of righteousness. This was a kind of transformation, and as they walked through one city after another, it formed a complete qualitative change. It was not an exaggeration to say that this was the biggest reward of the gray coat army soldiers. This kind of change was invisible and intangible, and even the soldiers themselves did not notice it, let alone outsiders. However, Tang En vaguely felt this, but other than being impressed by Rose's good luck, he did not have any other thoughts. Accompanied by the cheers along the way, after more than 10 days, the 30,000 soldiers with high morale finally approached the front line. When they arrived, the atmosphere was obviously different. Along the way, there were almost no merchants or civilians passing by. There were only military supplies in a hurry, and scouts who were rushing back and forth to pass on information. Although there was no war scene in sight, the atmosphere was as heavy as water, and it was as if a storm was brewing. In the evening, the army was stopped by a large group of cavalry 10 miles away from a large city. "Brother Fry, what's the situation?" Seeing that Fry had returned from scouting, Tang En and the others went up to him and asked. "The cavalry did not allow us to enter the city." Fray's face was a little gloomy as he shook his head and answered, Why?" David was stunned when he heard this, and then he asked in surprise, "Weren't we able to enter many cities before? This is Veza City." Seeing that everyone was a little confused, Fry continued to explain, "Veza City is the most rear city in Brand's front line, so if there is a war, this is where the military supplies are stored." He paused for a moment, then continued, "Such an important military base naturally would not allow the army to enter casually. Well, actually, Blank's army can enter. General Daniel has already shown the Brand Military Supply Department's certificate, and the cavalry only said that they wanted to go back and ask for instructions. However, we have waited for half an hour and still have not received a response." As soon as he finished speaking, everyone knew that something was wrong. Not to mention that they had all the military documents, they had caused a huge commotion along the way. As long as the governor of Veza City and the military officials were not deaf, they should have received the news long ago. However, now that they had just found out, their intentions were naturally obvious. David's eyes widened and he said angrily, "F***ck, they are obviously making things difficult for us." Actually, it's normal for something like this to happen. After all, they have been fighting for so many years. Moreover, we caused too much of a commotion before, so this is probably a show of strength. Fry used to be in the army, so he understood the psychology of the enemy. His analysis was not far from the truth. I think they need to be taught a lesson," Michaud said coldly, curling his lips slightly. Tang En also frowned. What did General Daniel say? What else could he say? Fry shook his head helplessly, looking at the faint outline of the city wall in the distance. "This is their territory. If they want to make things difficult for us, it would be very easy. Moreover, no matter where this kind of thing goes, they will have a reason to avoid it. General Daniel, I think he will tolerate it." Tang En heard this and nodded slowly, agreeing with Frey's deduction. Although it was a little frustrating, it was the truth. Now that the two sides had reached an agreement, it was time for cooperation, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. However, if they couldn't stop them openly, there were many small tricks that could be used to hinder them secretly. Just like now, there were some people with ulterior motives in Vasa City who had good reasons for not letting them in. For example, the sky was dark, and they had to ensure the safety of the logistical base, etc. In this regard, there was nothing they could say. Furthermore, when Twain found out that Daniel was the commander-in-chief of the army this time, he had already expected the outcome of such a situation. Daniel had a calm and collected personality, and he didn't show his emotions on his face. He was the most suitable commander for a battle like this. If it had been Dina, the commander of the 4th Division of the Grey Coat Army, he would have rolled up his sleeves and ordered his subordinates to take down the cavalry first. Sure enough, after waiting for another half an hour, the messenger ran around and announced that the soldiers should move to the left and enter the wilderness to rest. Once the order was given, everyone had to enter the wilderness and set up their tents while cursing. Along the way they had rested like this, but now that they were here, they still had to sleep in the wilderness. Naturally, they were unhappy. David and Luke had been mumbling to themselves that night, planning to sneak into the city and have a good chat with the soldiers guarding the city. However, Tang En stopped them from doing so. The situation was different now. After all, this wasn't the Grey Coat Army's encampment, and the Grey Space had full autonomy. This was the army, and under the rule of the Brand's military, no matter what happened, they had to abide by military law and couldn't be messed around. This was the reason why Tang En had brought the Grey Space to join Frey's Lance Battalion. At least here, they could move freely. The night passed silently. The next morning, the army arrived at the city. After some negotiation, they were officially ready to enter the city. These D*MN bastards, Frey's Lance Battalion, was at the rear of the army, and it would take a few minutes for them to enter the city. Thus, Tang En and Fry stood on a boulder by the road and looked at the city gate. "What's wrong?" Tang En turned around and asked Fry, who was cursing in a low voice. "The people who came out to greet General Daniel at the city gate are all insignificant people. The highest-ranking person is actually just a deputy colonel." Fry narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "They've provoked us time and time again. Do they really think we're made of mud?" Fry had been in the Brand's army for more than 10 years, so he was naturally familiar with the various military ranks. The Grey Coat Army had sent 30,000 people this time, which was comparable to the combined strength of 2 or 3 generals in the Brand's army. With such a lineup, the other party should have at least sent out a general to greet General Daniel. However, the highest-ranking person on the other side was only a deputy colonel, and a civilian at that. They didn't hide their contempt at all. Bang. F*CK, this is so F*King frustrating. David crushed a corner of the boulder with his foot and said gloomily, "How are we here to fight the barbarians? We're clearly here to be bullied. Let's go. Let's enter the city first." Haha, there should be a backup plan waiting for us. Tang En looked at the crowd in front of him and jumped down from the boulder. It was wartime now, so the city gate of Vasa City was naturally taken over by the army. Before they got close to the city gate, the Grey Coat Army soldiers could hear the mocking laughter coming from above the city wall. They looked up and saw groups of Brand's soldiers pointing at them, shaking their heads and laughing from time to time. The soldiers at the city gate didn't do that, but their sideways glances were full of disdain and contempt. The Grey Coat Army soldiers' faces were solemn as they quietly walked through the city gate. A wave of suppressed anger was constantly gathering. When it was Tang En's turn, David walked outside with his chin slightly raised and his eyes slightly narrowed. He looked provocatively at a soldier holding a spear. The soldier was stunned for a moment, and then his anger surged. He tightened his grip on the spear and glared at David. David rolled his eyes and curled the corners of his mouth. He slowed down and continued to taunt. However, it was obvious that it wasn't only the Grey Coat Army that had instructions. The Blank's army must have also made a rule that they couldn't make the first move. Therefore, even though the soldier's body was trembling slightly and he was ready to pounce, he still held back and didn't attack. David sneered disdainfully. He withdrew his gaze with slight disappointment and followed Tang En in front of him. Sigh, the new recruits these days have no courage at all. No wonder they were beaten up so badly by the barbarians. Another whisper came from the person behind David. His nickname was Skinny Monkey, and he was Frey's old friend. He was also familiar with Tang En and the others. They had all climbed out of the pit in the mine. He said this with confidence. After all, when he was in the army, these young soldiers in front of him were still learning how to hold a spear. Of course, although it was a whisper, it was still within the soldier's hearing range, just like David's sneer. The soldier's eyes instantly turned red. He took half a step forward and pressed down with the tip of his spear. However, he was instantly pulled back by someone who looked like a captain beside him. It was fine to scold someone, since there was no evidence. However, it was not allowed to make the first move. That would mean that he had to bear the responsibility. Bastard! Who is the bastard scolding? The bastard is scolding you. After a quick conversation. Oh. The veteran Skinny Monkey gave the soldier a thumbs up. His face was full of praise, and then he slowly followed David in front. Hee. After regaining their senses, the surrounding gray-coat army soldiers all sneered and looked at the guy who called himself a bastard. You motherf asterisk cur die. Don't leave if you have the guts. Captain, don't pull me. In the small area of chaos, David looked back and saw the brand soldier being carried by the captain. His face was red, and his arms and legs were flailing wildly. Yo, brother Skinny Monkey, you're still the best. Hee, no, my skills are too weak. Skinny Monkey waved his hand modestly. In the past, our Thunder Spear Formation breaking team had a guy called Cheap Bird. That guy's mouth. There was one time when we were in a bad situation and needed to break out. However, the barbarians' formation was flawless, and the cost of breaking out was too high. In the end, he just used his mouth to make dozens of barbarians fly into a rage. They couldn't help but attack first, and the formation was disrupted. F***CK, this is simply too awesome. After the incident at the city gate, the army officially entered the city. As long as the brand cities were close to the front line, they would have a strong military style. Vesa City was no exception. At a glance, there were not many wooden buildings. Most of them were made of stone, bricks, and tiles. This was probably to prevent the enemy from attacking with fire. The main road in the city was naturally left for the soldiers to pass through. However, there were still many civilians who woke up early. They seemed to be used to this situation and didn't pay much attention to the soldiers. They were all busy with their own things. With so many soldiers, it was naturally impossible to stay in the city. Therefore, after observing for too long, the soldiers directly turned around in the city and headed south. After passing through the heavily guarded south gate, Tang En and the others came to a large military camp surrounded by mountains. Since Vesa City was a place where military supplies were stored, there were naturally many reserve soldiers. After training here for a period of time, they would be transferred to the front line whenever the situation was critical. Because they had spent a lot of time before, when the Grey Coat Army approached the military camp, Dongfang Shuri's face was completely exposed. At this time, the army was also training. On the wide, flat grassland on the right side, there was about a regiment of Brand Spear Regiment practicing their spear skills. From time to time, there would be loud roars filled with murderous intent. Looking further away, there were round wooden signs with faint red dots in the middle. It seemed to be an archery training ground. Damn, the difference is really big. The Grey Coat Army's conditions were difficult. The soldiers were directly pulled to a place to train their physical fitness or how to use weapons. Therefore, it was no wonder that David sighed as he looked at the various training grounds and equipment around him. After all, this is the front line. Fry was just about to continue David's words when the soldiers in front suddenly exclaimed in a low voice. The neat formation also paused and seemed to be a little chaotic. "What's going on?" Tangan and David, who were walking on the periphery of the team, turned their bodies sideways and looked forward. However, there were many soldiers in front of them doing the same, so they couldn't see anything. However, they didn't have to wait for too long. Soon, a group of brand soldiers appeared on the right side of the road. Thud, 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 thud. They were like giants walking on the hills. Every move they made caused the ground to tremble. Because there was a certain rhythm to their movements, everyone's heart beat faster. Although the group of brand soldiers in front of them weren't giants, to some extent, they played a crushing role in the war. They had a large square shield in their left hand and a long-handled battle axe in their right hand. Their entire body was covered in heavy silver-gray metal armor. Even their heads were covered with a closed helmet that only left a gap for their eyes. This was an abnormal soldier class that was armed to the teeth in the truest sense of the word. Brand heavy infantry. Tangan whispered to himself. He had seen this type of soldier class before when he first joined the Grey Coat Army. At that time, the Darren team he was in was ambushed. They were almost blocked by the soldiers in front of them. In the end, they were lucky enough to activate Mjolnir and blast them away, allowing everyone to escape. Another show of strength. Fry looked at the large group of heavy infantry that brushed past them. His breathing stagnated. He opened his mouth and murmured while shaking his head. This was the truth. No one would wear such heavy equipment to train early in the morning. This was obviously a show for the Grey Coat Army soldiers. It had to be said that they did have the right to show off. First of all, the Grey Coat Army soldiers looked like clowns in comparison, not to mention the standard superior heavy armor that covered their entire body. Furthermore, when a large group of heavy infantrymen marched together, the aura they produced was absolutely astonishing. Even if there were 30,000 soldiers around them, they would still be suppressed by this barbaric aura. Bah, damn it! Isn't it just a good turtle shell? What's there to show off about? Looking at the heavy infantry passing by, David spat fiercely and said with disdain. Of course, there was a hint of jealousy in his words. Not to mention anything else, just look at how every place the large group of heavy infantry passed by, the formation of soldiers would pause and become silent. Such an obvious momentum was truly shocking. After the group of heavy infantry passed by, although most people knew that this should be the enemy's plan, the Grey Coat Army's troops inevitably felt a little depressed. The Pike Regiment soldiers who were originally training on the right side of the training area had also collectively turned their gazes the moment the heavy infantrymen appeared. Across the iron fence, they pointed at them as if they were comparing with each other. From time to time, they would let out ear-piercing laughter. David and the others saw this and their hearts surged with anger, but there was no good way to deal with it. Just like how they provoked the other party with curses just now, this was a show of disdain. It was just a matter of who couldn't help but make the first move. And just as the morale of the two sides was rising, another unforeseen event occurred. Whoosh! The bowstring vibrated, and the arrow whistled. Chapter 462. Whoosh! The arrow came from the right side of the training ground. Although there was some commotion around, Tang-un, David, Michaud and the others suddenly turned their heads and locked on to the location and direction of the arrow. Fry and some of the veterans also reacted quickly and found the direction of the arrow. However, since they could hear the sound, it could only mean that the arrow was not far from them. As long as the arrow was not directly aimed at them, it was impossible to separate the crowd and rush up to intercept it. Tang-en and the others did not make a move. They narrowed their eyes and watched the arrow pass through the iron fence of the training ground and shoot into the troops more than 10 meters in front of them. Then, the marching troops suddenly stopped and an uproar broke out. Damn it, they dare to attack us. Fuck, let's fight them. The soldiers at the back reacted a little slower. When they looked up, they saw that the arrow was shot into the troop. Seeing that there was some chaos in front of them, they thought that someone was injured. Suddenly, the crowd became angry and the sound of weapons being unsheathed rose one after another. Stop, don't be impulsive. Stop moving forward, stay where you are and don't move without permission. The surrounding officers, such as Fry, shouted at the first moment to suppress the situation and calm down the restless soldiers. Tang En narrowed his eyes and looked at several people running from the training ground. The corner of his mouth slightly twitched. Let's go and have a look. After that, he directly stepped out of the formation. David and the other members of the gray space heard this and their faces turned cold. Naturally, the soldiers could not leave the formation without permission. However, the gray space was an exception. They were not part of the military system, and they were a regimental organization. There was no one around who could order them around. After some of the soldiers recognized the identity of the gray space, they were even more excited and shouted to teach them a lesson. David and the others also nodded happily. Just as Fry suppressed the soldiers under him and rushed over with a few of his old brothers, Tang En and the others also arrived at the scene of the incident. They separated the surrounding crowd and saw an arrow stuck diagonally in the ground. Most of it was buried in the ground. Michaud's eyes flashed as he looked at the archery training area and snorted, "Humph, your archery skills are not bad." This was the truth. The army naturally did not move in a swarm. There would be a distance of a few steps between each organization. This arrow was obviously shot at this distance. Although it sounded easy, it was much more difficult to actually execute. After all, the soldiers were always on the move, and there was an iron fence in the middle. For the enemy to be able to predict and pass through the gap of the fence that was only the size of a palm, his archery skills were indeed very good. At this time, the few people in the training area had also arrived at the iron fence. The leader was a middle-aged man with a longbow in his hand, dressed in standard leather armor. I'm really sorry. My hand slipped, and I didn't control my aim well. Well, no one was hurt, right? There was nothing wrong with the words of an apology, but it was a completely different matter when paired with a disapproving expression and a completely different target. The faces of the gray coat army soldiers outside the fence turned ugly, but they couldn't do anything about it. That's right, everyone could see that this was definitely not because of a slip of the hand. But no matter what, the other party didn't hurt anyone, and now he came over to explain and apologize hypocritically. They couldn't find any evidence at all. Your mother's fart, are your eyes on your butt? Do you dare to say that this wasn't intentional? David strode to the fence and pointed at the middle-aged man as he shouted loudly. The middle-aged man took a step back and spread out his hands with a playful expression. Little brother, why do you say that? I already said that it was because of a slip of the hand. And, you said that I did it on purpose. Do you have evidence? That's right, show us the evidence. If you don't blame us for accusing you of insulting and slandering an active officer. I think it's fine to complain. It's just a bunch of bumpkins who haven't seen the world. That's right. Let them see the instructor's amazing archery skills. It's already enough for them. As soon as David started to make things difficult for them, the people behind the middle-aged man who was called the instructor couldn't stand it and started to mock and ridicule him. Of course, David wouldn't be angered so easily. He spat disdainfully at the middle-aged man's feet. Bah, I thought you had some guts, but I didn't expect you to be a coward who doesn't dare to admit what you did. The middle-aged instructor's face twitched. He put his hands behind his back and expressionlessly pretended that he didn't hear anything. He shook his head at the soldiers behind him. Forget it, let's not lower ourselves to their level. Let's go, huh? His words paused, and his body that was halfway turned around suddenly trembled. He looked at Fry, who was rushing over with an expression as if he had seen a ghost. His outstretched arm trembled slightly, and he cried out involuntarily, "Fry, Fry?" Fry, who had rushed over, looked at the arrows that were shot into the ground and roughly guessed what had happened. After hearing the sharp cry, he turned to look at the middle-aged instructor. His eyes narrowed slightly. He looked a little familiar, but he couldn't remember his name. You are not dead yet." Fry frowned. The other party said this, so he obviously knew about his previous crimes. However, Fry still couldn't figure out who the other party was. He turned to look at Skinny Monkey-like and a few other old brothers. They basically felt the same way. They were a little puzzled, but they all shook their heads. After all, Fry had left the army for more than 10 years. Other than those who had been through life and death situations with him, like Baylor, he could still remember. He naturally couldn't remember those who weren't familiar with him in the past. However, Fry didn't care about this. It was true that he had committed crimes in the past, but now that he had joined the Grey Coat Army, and the Grey Coat Army was cooperating with Bran, the other party naturally wouldn't break this relationship because of him. After all, if they really wanted to settle old scores, most of the people in the Grey Coat Army had much more serious criminal records than him. After the middle-aged instructor screamed involuntarily, he barely suppressed the stormy waves in his heart. He no longer looked at Fry and turned to leave. At this moment, Tang En bent over and pulled out the arrow from the ground. He said calmly, "You want to leave now? Aren't you going to take your arrows with you?" Pausing, the middle-aged instructor turned around and pursed his lip. "No need. I'll leave them to you." "Haha, that's right. I'll give you something to remember. If you have nothing to do, practice more. Tisk, it's useless no matter how much they practice. How can these bumpkins learn the instructor's godly archery skills?" Tang En ignored these clowns and said loudly, "Luke. Coming, boss." Luke, dressed in black armor, walked out from behind with a bow and arrow on his back. Handing over the arrow, Tang En patted him on the shoulder. "Give this arrow back to them. Haha, watch closely, boss." Luke took the arrow with a cheeky smile and took off the bow wrapped in layers of cloth from his back. The middle-aged instructor's expression changed. He turned around and looked at Luke first, then stared at the black longbow warily. The Bulan soldiers reacted as well. Their bodies tensed up. "How dare you?" Obviously, they also realized that Luke was going to fight back, but they were the only ones here. "Haha, look at how cowardly you are." Luke glanced at them contemptuously and grabbed the longbow. "Don't worry. I don't want to dirty my bow if I kill you." After saying that, he adjusted his breathing and narrowed his eyes as he looked into the distance at the training ground. The middle-aged instructor and the others followed Luke's gaze and were surprised to see that he was looking at an archery target. You're not trying to shoot an archery target, are you?" One of the Bran soldiers turned around and sneered. Are you kidding? Even if you're ignorant, you should know your limits. The distance is at least 200 meters. It'll be a miracle if you can even touch the target, let alone hit it." After realizing that Luke's target seemed to be an archery target, the Bran soldiers all had ridiculous expressions on their faces. However, if one disregarded the mockery in their words, what the soldiers said was the truth. Bows and arrows were considered mid-range weapons, but that was only relative. An ordinary longbow could only shoot at a distance of 200 to 300 meters at most, and that was only the maximum range, not the effective range. In terms of accuracy, if one could accurately hit a target within 100 meters, one could be considered a sharpshooter. When the middle-aged instructor had shown his skill earlier, the range was only about 80 meters. But now, the distance was more than 200 meters. How could he shoot accurately if he couldn't even see clearly? "Shut up. It's a good bow. What a pity." Luke was holding the flying eagle bow, which Tang En had obtained from killing Goshawk. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that this bow was now the most valuable item in the gray space. It was even more valuable than Tang En's black meteorite mother-of-iron dagger. The middle-aged instructor was an excellent archer and naturally knew a lot about bows. He narrowed his eyes as he stared at the flying eagle bow in Luke's hand. A greedy look flashed across his face before he shook his head and sighed regretfully. I admit that your bow has enough range, but if you want to hit the bullseye… Humph. Tang En raised an eyebrow and gave the middle-aged instructor a meaningful look. It wasn't just contempt in those words. It had to be pointed out that Luke had never said what his target was, but the other party had now set the target on the bullseye. This was unwittingly digging a hole for Luke. But even though he had seen through the other party's intentions, Tang En didn't expose him. He had confidence in Luke's archery skills. Taking a few steps left and right, Luke measured with his fingers and narrowed his eyes, as if he was choosing an angle to shoot from. You bumpkin, are you going to shoot or not? Don't tell me you're scared. Do you even need to ask? If you're scared, just say it. Don't waste our time here. Hee, if he can hit the bullseye, I'll call him Grandpa. Let's not. I don't have a grandson like you. Open. Luke suddenly exhaled and stepped forward. He drew the bow to the fullest and loosed it at the instructor's head. Whoosh! Chapter 463. The bow was pulled back like a full moon, and the arrow shot out like a shooting star. Other than the middle-aged instructor, who was in a daze, everyone's eyes and head subconsciously followed the arrow that left the bowstring. The reason why the instructor didn't turn around was because Luke's arrow was clearly aimed at his head. In that instant, the middle-aged instructor even smelled the scent of death, and his hands and feet turned cold. A moment later, he felt a sharp wind blow over his head, and his scalp went numb. After leaving the longbow, the arrow was like a bird of prey that had been released from its cage as it whistled through the air in a beautiful parabola. At that moment, whether or not the arrow hit the target, everyone knew in their hearts that the arrow definitely had a range of more than 200 meters. This wasn't a lie, because the arrow was already halfway to the target, but its upward momentum still hadn't stopped. Got it. That was the thought that popped into the minds of Fry and the others. This was also the sensitive prediction that veterans of hundreds of battles had when it came to the direction of an arrow. This kind of prediction would allow them to preserve their lives on the battlefield where arrows were flying everywhere. Of course, this, got it, was only because they were confident that the arrow would hit the target. As for the bullseye, it was hard to say. After all, in their eyes, the bullseye was indeed too small. After crossing more than half the distance, the arrow fell diagonally, accelerated, and swooped down with unstoppable force toward the target area. There were many targets in this area. If the arrow was shot from the front, the targets would be 50 meters, 80 meters, 100 meters, 150 meters. Beyond that, there would be fine sand. This wasn't for accurate shooting, but to train the archer's shooting skills. In everyone's eyes, the arrow flew steadily over the area in front of them and headed straight for the one and only 150 meters away. Bang! From Tang En's point of view, it was impossible to see the bullseye in an instant. Thus, everyone only saw the wooden target fall after the arrow hit it, and then the clear sound of impact could be heard in the distance. Whoosh! Nice. Beautiful. Domineering, when the gray-coat army soldiers saw that the arrow had hit the target, their hearts, which had been in their throats, were instantly relieved. Then, a strong sense of excitement and dizziness overwhelmed them, and they couldn't help but raise their weapons and cheer loudly. Their morale was greatly boosted, and their momentum was like a rainbow, sweeping away their previous depression. Tang En and the others were fine. After all, they knew Luke's skills. Hitting the target just meant that Luke hadn't made a mistake. Fry and the others had heard about it, but when they saw it with their own eyes, they couldn't help but crowd around Luke in ecstasy and pat his back crazily. Bang! Bang! Haha, good job, Luke! Well done, you're King proud. Your archery skills are simply godly. You'll definitely be a killing machine on the battlefield. These praises were not without reason. If there was a sharpshooter in the team, the chances of victory on the battlefield would be much higher. The logic behind this was very simple. With such godly archery skills, the enemy officers and generals did not have much longer lives than ordinary soldiers. What's there to be arrogant about? It's just hitting the target, not the bullseye. That's right, he's just relying on his bow. The target is so big, of course it's easier. Seeing the high morale on the other side, the soldiers behind the middle-aged instructor were a little diffident, but they still braced themselves and struggled. In the face of this stubbornness, David and the others naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity to beat the dog in the water. He curled his lips and said, "Oh, now you know how to talk about bullseye. Didn't you say that you couldn't even touch the target at the beginning? Easy?" Michaud pointed at the flying eagle bow in Luke's hand and smiled coldly. "I can lend you this bow. I won't talk about bullseye. Any target over there, if you hit it, I'll give you my life. If not, you'll give me your life. Do you dare to gamble?" After a few words, the soldiers were suddenly speechless. Their faces turned red, but they couldn't say a word. Gamble with their lives? What a joke. Even if the flying eagle bow was given to them, they wouldn't be able to pull it open, let alone hit the target. In the end, they could only argue. Anyway, the results aren't out yet. It might not be bullseye. Hee. Michaud sneered again. Pointing at the soldiers running toward the target in the distance, he said casually, "How about this? Let's change the bet. If the arrow doesn't hit the bullseye, I'll still give you my life. If it hits the bullseye, you'll give me your life. How does that sound?" "TSK, sounds fun. Count me in." David walked out and pointed at a random soldier. "I won't bully you. Let's bet a life for a life." "Alas, you're putting a lot of pressure on me." Scratching his head, Luke stepped forward and pointed at the remaining soldiers. "I'll bet with you." Rubbing his nose, Tang En looked at the middle-aged instructor who was still in a daze. "You're the only one left. Do you want to join in?" The soldiers in the distance were still cheering loudly, but there was a sudden silence. The soldiers were stunned when they saw Tang En and the others stand out. It had to be said that the wild attitude of Tang En and the rest about casually betting their lives scared them a little. This was too damn bold and unrestrained. It was also because of this that the crowd did not know whether to cheer or not. If they didn't cheer, they wouldn't be able to maintain morale. If they cheered, wouldn't they become accomplices if something went wrong? Compared with the conflicted soldiers, Tang En and the others were much calmer. They couldn't see the result of the bullseye, but Luke's eyes were almost as sharp as an eagle's. Naturally, he could see it. Seeing that the other party was completely unresponsive, David urged anxiously, "Hurry up and give us a straight answer. Do you want to bet or not?" "David, you can't do that." Luke waved his hand solemnly. After a pause, he bowed slightly and said rather obscenely, "Let's bet. Actually, I don't have much confidence." "Well, we're just scaring you, and we're also very scared. Come, isn't it just a life?" His words were gentle and kind as he patiently guided her. He seemed to be trying his best to persuade her. Bet your lives, all you know is to bet your lives. Were you not born and raised by your parents? The soldiers who were at the heart of the storm bit their lips and cursed crazily in their hearts, but in the end they didn't dare say anything. In fact, they didn't really believe that Luke could hit the bullseye, but their lives were at stake, and the other party's reaction was a little strange. In the end, they didn't dare act recklessly. The middle-aged instructor was still expressionless. He slowly took off the leather helmet on his head and lowered his head to look at it, before he gripped it tightly. Right at that moment, a dignified voice came from outside. "What's going on?" The crowd dispersed, and Daniel, in advanced armor, walked in with a dozen people. He was slightly surprised to see Tang En and the others. Next to him were the Bran officers who had received them at the city gate earlier. Fry went up to them and quickly told them the whole story. Isn't this nonsense? The invasion of the northern wilderness is imminent. How can we, the Bran, kill each other? Daniel's eyes flashed, and he frowned as he reprimanded Tang En and the others. He then changed the topic. Besides, the Grey Coat army is here at the front line to kill the barbarians. How can we waste our time on this nonsense? Pausing, he glanced at the Bran officers who had ugly expressions on their faces. Don't you think that's the case? The Bran officers looked at each other, a little speechless. Of course, they weren't idiot. They understood the situation at a glance. Daniel's words seemed to be lecturing his soldiers, but the words nonsense were definitely mocking the Bran soldiers. You're right, General. Tang En of course understood the meaning behind it. He took a few steps forward and saluted. He then said, There's some misunderstanding here. Actually, this Bran officer wants to compare archery skills with us. Of course, there needs to be some kind of reward. So, we've decided to make a small bet to lighten the mood. Haha, but there needs to be an end to everything. So, I hope you'll approve and let us continue with this bet. A bet of life, a small bet to lighten the mood. The corner of Daniel's mouth twitched. However, when he saw the confidence in Tang En's eyes, he raised his eyebrows and the corner of his mouth slightly raised. How bold of you to mention a bet. But what you said makes some sense. When a soldier speaks, he means what he says. He can't be a backstabber. He paused and looked at the Bran officers beside him. What do you think? Ahem, this matter. The Bran officers stuttered again. First, they looked at the Bran soldiers who were rushing over with a target in their hand. Then, they looked at the middle-aged instructor and the others and muttered to themselves. Sir. At this moment, the middle-aged instructor quivered. He quickly raised his hand and shouted, We admit defeat. The bet was just a joke. This brother from the Grey Coat army has godly archery skills. We admit defeat. The Bran officers frowned. Their faces instantly darkened. In fact, they just wanted to order these people to accept the bet. Even if they lost, it would be better than this embarrassing situation. After all, if they didn't accept Daniel's words, the Bran military would be labeled as a backstabber. However, they didn't expect the middle-aged instructor to admit defeat. Not only did he admit to being a backstabber, but he also gained the reputation of being a coward. This put them in a more passive position and disgraced them. Ha! Daniel looked up and laughed. He said, You are indeed a Bran soldier. You are so magnanimous. Even when you admit defeat, you are still so generous. It's a good way to solve this. We didn't hurt each other's feelings. Pause for a while. He looked at the soldiers around him and clapped his hands twice. I propose a round of applause for our brave Bran soldiers. He emphasized the word brave. Daniel was a calm person. When he was treated with contempt, he didn't fly into a rage. However, this didn't mean that he wasn't angry. Now that he had the opportunity to hit them while they were down, how could he let it go? Clap, clap, clap. Thunderous applause sounded for a long time. The soldiers pursed their lips. Their expressions were extremely strange. There were also some who didn't care. They laughed loudly and praised the Bran soldiers for being sensible. Several Bran officers trembled. Their faces turned green. The clapping was like a slap on their faces. At this moment, the soldier who was carrying the target finally ran over. He was panting heavily. He didn't see the Bran officers at the side. He was ecstatic as he raised the target to the middle-aged instructor. Large and small circles were drawn on the target, and the sides of the circle were densely covered with marks left by the arrows. The closer to the center, the fewer the marks were. On the red center, there was not even a single mark. However, although there were no marks, there was an arrow that had pierced through the red center. The tip of the arrow even protruded from the back of the target. Huff. Instructor, huff. Instructor, you hit it, you hit it. Your archery is amazing, haha. there was silence. Chapter 464. Huff. Instructor, Huff. Instructor, it's a hit, a hit. Your archery is amazing, ha. Everyone fell silent. The arrow just now had come from here, and it was a standard brand arrow. The soldier was well aware of the middle-aged instructor's archery skills, and thought that he had outdone himself this time. Thus, he immediately ran over to report the good news. After a while, the middle-aged instructor snapped back to his senses. Shut up! His face turned green and white, and he looked rather unsightly. Wow! The soldiers also came back to their senses at that moment, and they immediately burst into thunderous cheers and applause. But this time, it wasn't mockery, but genuine admiration for Luke's amazing archery skills. Daniel was also excited. Although the other party had admitted defeat, they had already won the battle. But now that he had gained face, he naturally felt a different kind of joy. It could be said that he had completely vented his anger at the other party for making things difficult for him. He patted Luke's shoulder and said a few words of encouragement. Then, he nodded at Tang En and left, completely ignoring the Bran officers whose faces had turned green. You. Good. Exasperated, he said good 3 times to the middle-aged instructor and his men. The Bran officers were too ashamed to stay any longer, and left in a huff. It wasn't surprising that they were so angry. They had made the Grey Coat Army stay outside the city last night, made things difficult for them at the city gates this morning, and pressured them with heavy infantry just now. This was all part of the Bran military's plan to give the Grey Coat Army an unforgettable show of strength. But the middle-aged instructor's move definitely wasn't part of their plan. After all, it was hard to say whether or not an arrow was accurate. If they really did hurt someone, they would be put in a very passive position. But now, not only had their plan failed completely, they had also become a joke in front of the other party. They had really shot themselves in the foot, and had to swallow their blood and teeth. After the matter was settled for the time being, the Grey Coat Army naturally continued forward. But compared with the sullen atmosphere earlier, the soldiers were now all puffed out their chests and their morale was greatly boosted. David and the others were probably the only ones who were a little dissatisfied. Looking at the middle-aged instructor and the others leave, they grumbled that they hadn't acted well and that the other party hadn't taken the bait. It's over. Looking at the faces of the lords just now, we must have been remembered. We won't be sent to the front line as cannon fodder, right? A soldier beside the middle-aged instructor said with a sad face on the way back. His footsteps were particularly heavy. Bah, you jinx. Can't you say something more pleasant? Hey, even if you're angry, don't vent your anger on me. If you didn't instigate the instructor to display his archery skills, would this have happened? Motherf *Kerr, who knew that kid's archery would be so accurate. Over 200 meters, it's really King strange. Besides, didn't you King agree at that time? Aye, that's enough. Why are you still arguing? The soldier who had been silent all this while suddenly waved his hand. If the instructor hadn't admitted defeat on the spot, we would have been dead by now. The quarreling duo immediately quieted down. What he said was true. At that time, both sides had people present. Once they agreed to the bet, they would definitely not be able to deny it. In the end, it would be difficult for them to escape a knife to their neck. Thinking like that, it wasn't unacceptable for them to be sent to the front line as cannon fodder. After all, at least they were still alive. Hearing that, the middle-aged instructor at the front paused and subconsciously lowered his head to look at the leather helmet in his hand. At the top of the leather helmet, there was an obvious hole that had just been torn open. If the helmet was worn on the head, the hole would just graze the scalp and wouldn't damage the entire helmet. The angle was perfect. This was the effect of Luke's arrow earlier. It was also the reason why the middle-aged instructor would rather be hated by the officers and admit defeat on the spot. As it turned out, he had made the right choice. If he had been a moment later, he might have been tricked by the officers. Instructor, HM? What should we do? Coming back to his senses, the middle-aged instructor looked at the worried and fearful faces of the soldiers and pondered for a moment. He then waved his hand and said, "Don't worry too much. Those are civilian officers. They can't do anything to us." That's right. They're just civilian officers. They're not on the same side as us at all. What's there to be afraid of? As expected of an instructor. You're truly knowledgeable. Hearing the middle-aged instructor's words, the soldiers instantly felt a weight lifted off their shoulders, and they started flattering him again. The middle-aged instructor's lips curled up slightly as he chuckled soundlessly. He hadn't said everything he wanted to say. It was true that the civilian officers couldn't do anything to them, but that might not be the case for other people. He had heard about the Grey Coat Army's display of strength. This wasn't a plan that a few officers could come up with. But even if a big shot got involved, the unlucky ones wouldn't be him, but these soldiers. After all, at this point, he was confident that he could get through this with his connections. However, after thinking for a while, the middle-aged instructor put this matter aside and thought of something else that was even more unexpected. Fry was really tough. He was still alive after causing such a huge mess. This was troublesome. Although it didn't have much to do with him, if he were to bring up old scores, the general, well, he had to plan early. After thinking for a while, the middle-aged instructor turned around and said, "All right, today's training will end here. Well, go and find a messenger. I have something to do." "Yes, sir." The next few days were peaceful. Probably because they were worried about uncontrollable situations such as gang fights, the Grey Coat Army's barracks were separated from the Brand's barracks. Although the two sides had interacted during training and meals, and they constantly provoked each other with their expressions and words, under the suppression of their respective officers, it didn't escalate to a physical fight. Other than these normal activities, the Grey Coat Army's soldiers were basically in the barracks and were restricted from going out. Tang En and the others could go out, but there wasn't much to walk around in the barracks. As for going to Vesa City, that was impossible. The south gate was heavily guarded. Unless they had a warrant from a high-ranking officer, even the Brand soldiers couldn't enter the city. However, although their freedom was restricted, they still received a lot of information about the front line. The information that the Grey Coat Army received from the front line was either too one-sided or too outdated. Now that they were at the front line, the information they received was naturally different. First of all, the situation in the Brand was far more serious than what was reported in the newspapers. This time, the northern wilderness tribes had changed their style of robbing and leaving immediately. Instead, they had sent out all their elite. There was information that indicated that the tribes had sent most of their barbarian soldiers, as if they were going to fight with their lives on the line. Knowing this, the noble negotiation team's quick and decisive approach to the negotiations made sense. In addition, the front line in the north of the Brand was vast. Now, other than the area guarded by the Zichen Legion that was still impregnable, the Tsang Yen and Thunder Legions were in a difficult situation. They could only retreat and defend the city, but they didn't have the ability to fight back. Also, there was vague information that some barbarian soldiers had begun to test the Zichen Legion's defensive line. It seemed like they were going to make a big move. Regarding the latter information, the Grey Coat Army soldiers were a little confused. Logically speaking, testing the Zichen Legion's defensive line meant that the northern wilderness tribes had achieved a great strategic success. Even if the Brand wasn't in a state of panic, they should still be worried. However, when the Brand soldiers heard this, they were excited and their morale was greatly boosted. Actually, this strange situation was easy to explain. The Grey Coat Army soldiers who had been fighting at the back naturally didn't know how important the Zechen Legion was in the hearts of the Brand soldiers. They also didn't know how high the status of Z, who was called the god of war by the people, was. It could be said that as long as Z was still in the Zechen Legion, in the hearts of the soldiers, the Brand was undefeatable. Previously, the Purple Star Army had not made any movements in the region they were stationed in. Sporadic news had come in, and most of it was about the merchants who had colluded with the enemy and sold food to the northern wilderness. This had greatly disappointed the soldiers. However, everyone understood. After all, the Zechen Legion's defensive line was very important. If it was lost, then the barbarians in the northern wilderness would be able to roam freely in the hundreds of thousands of kilometers north of the Brand. However, the current situation was that the barbarians had taken the initiative to step into the Zechen Legion's territory. Naturally, it was a different story. All the soldiers rubbed their eyes and waited for the god of war, Z, to lead the Zechen Legion to attack and kill in all directions. In the end, there was still no news of Sessman's location that Tang En wanted to know. However, there was news about the Temple of Light, but it was about purifying cults and heretics in the northern wilderness and had nothing to do with Sessman. Tang En was not in a hurry. He had already expected this situation. After all, the front line was very big and there was a high turnover of people. It was impossible to quickly determine a person's location. However, as long as he left this place and actually came into contact with the front line, he would eventually be able to find out more about Sessman. In addition to Tang En's search, he had also discussed with Josiah that the secret organization would set up branches in the frontline cities as soon as possible to collect all information about Sessman and the Temple of Light. With such a strong intelligence network, Tang En naturally did not have to worry about not being able to find Sessman's location. The boring days in Vesa City were only temporary. In fact, the Brand's military was also having a headache about how to use the 30,000 soldiers of the Grey Coat Army. If possible, they wanted to send all these people to be cannon fodder. However, if that was really the case, then the relationship between the two sides would be broken. Of course, it was even more impossible to arrange for them to spend their days leisurely in the backline city. This kind of dilemma did not last long. After all, if they put these unstable factors in the backline, the Brand's higher-ups would feel even more uneasy. Finally, 5 days later, the 30,000 soldiers of the Grey Coat Army left Vesa City one after another and rushed to the frontline battlefield. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.